The gold transport wagon never saw them coming. Jack Rivers had warned them about Dead Man's Pass. In his 45 years, he'd learned to trust the prickling at the back of his neck, that sixth sense honed through 4 years of hell during the war between the states, and 15 more as a hired gun across the untamed West. But Hollister, the Wells Fargo man, had insisted they push through before the storm hit his eastern arrogance, as thick as the gray clouds building above the jagged Colorado peaks. "Ain't natural," the driver had muttered as they entered the narrow canyon snow already dusting the pine-covered slopes rising steep on either side. "Too quiet." Jack had nodded Winchester repeater across his lap, eyes scanning the ridge lines. 6 men, 2 wagons, the lead carrying mail and supplies, the second carrying gold from the Union Pacific payroll. Easy pickings in this perfect killing ground. His gloved finger tapped against the trigger guard, that old familiar tension coiling in his gut. The first shot came from nowhere and everywhere, echoing off the canyon walls. The driver jerked crimson blooming across his chest, then toppled sideways from the seat. Jack was already moving, diving for cover, as the world erupted in gunfire. The horses screamed, rearing in terror, as bullets splintered wood and tore through canvas. "Ambush! Get down!" Jack roared, firing at muzzle flashes in the trees. He caught a glimpse of black coats, dark bandanas over faces, and the gleam of badges, not the typical road agents, but something more organized, more dangerous. Hollister went down next, a neat hole appearing between his eyes before he could even clear his pistol. The guards from the second wagon returned fire, but they were sitting ducks silhouetted against the snow. One by one, they fell. A bullet grazed Jack's temple, hot pain followed by warm wetness. He rolled under the wagon, came up on the other side, and fired 3 rapid shots that dropped 2 attackers from the ridge. The satisfying sound of bodies tumbling through brush was small comfort in a fight they couldn't win. "Rivers," a voice called from the rocks, "we only want what you're carrying. Surrender, and you walk away." Jack's response was another shot that found its mark. A scream of pain telling him he'd hit something vital. "Wrong answer," the voice called back. The dynamite came next, not thrown under the wagons as expected, but onto the slope above. The explosion sent a cascade of rock and snow down on their position. Jack leapt clear of the wagon just as it was crushed beneath the small avalanche. Something struck him hard. Rock or bullet, he couldn't tell. The world went white, then black. Consciousness returned with the taste of blood and sea. Jack blinked ice from his eyelashes, his breath fogging in the bitter cold. The storm had arrived, heavy flakes already burying the massacre. He pushed himself upright, pain lancing through his side, where a bullet had carved a furrow across his ribs. His head throbbed from the graze at his temple. The wagons were destroyed, the bodies of his companions already half covered in white. Jack checked each one, finding no survivors. When he reached Hollister, he rifled through the man's coat until he found what he was looking for: a sealed packet of documents and a small leather pouch. He stuffed both inside his sheepskin coat, grimacing at the pain that shot through his side. His horse was dead shot through the neck. He salvaged what he could: ammunition canteen, his saddlebags with jerky and hardtack, and started walking. The nearest town was Silver Creek, 20 miles north. In good weather, with a horse, it would have been an easy ride. In a blizzard, on foot, wounded. Jack pulled his worn cavalry hat lower and turned his collar up against the biting wind, one foot in front of the other. He'd survived worse odds during the war, survived Chancellorsville, and the wilderness, survived a rebel prison camp. He could survive this. But as the light faded and the temperature plummeted, doubt crept in with the cold. Blood seeped steadily from his wounds, leaving a damning trail in the snow. Whoever had attacked the wagon would be following, making sure there were no witnesses. His tracks would be easy to follow until the snow covered them, if he lasted that long. Night fell like a shroud. The pines were black sentinels against the snow-filled darkness. Jack stumbled on, guided only by the faint glow of white beneath his boots, and the knowledge that north meant survival. His thoughts grew jumbled as cold and blood loss took their toll. He thought of Virginia in springtime of apple blossoms, and his wife's smile before the war changed everything. He thought of the letter from Judge Harrison that had brought him to Colorado, a chance at redemption, a chance to bring down the men who'd framed him for murder back in Denver. Now Harrison was dead too, if the rumors were true, and Jack was a wanted man with a price on his head. The irony wasn't lost on him. After all he'd survived, he would die anonymously in a Colorado blizzard, another victim of the endless cycle of violence that had defined the last 20 years of his life. When his knees finally buckled, Jack didn't immediately rise. The snow felt almost warm now, a bad sign he knew distantly. The temptation to rest just for a moment was overwhelming. Then he saw it, a faint flickering glow through the curtain of snow and trees. Lamplight. A cabin. Hope was more powerful than pain. Jack forced himself to his feet, staggering toward that promise of warmth and shelter. The distance seemed impossible, the light appearing and disappearing as the storm swirled between the trees. But he pressed on one agonizing step after another. The cabin materialized from the darkness, small but sturdy smoke curling from a stone chimney. A barn stood nearby, half buried in snowdrifts. Jack's frozen fingers fumbled at the gate of a fence encircling the property. Then he was stumbling up to the door, each breath like fire in his lungs. He raised a fist to knock, then hesitated. Whoever lived here would be taking a risk by helping him. The men who'd attacked the wagon wouldn't stop hunting until all witnesses were eliminated. But the cold made the decision for him. Jack pounded on the rough-hewn door, leaving smears of half-frozen blood on the wood. "Hello?" he called, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. "Anyone there?" Silence. Then the scrape of a chair, footsteps approaching. "Who's there?" A woman's voice, strong, despite its age, wary but not frightened. "Name's Jack Rivers," he managed. "I'm hurt. My transport was attacked. Please." The bolt slid back, and the door opened a crack. Just enough for Jack to find himself staring down the barrel of a Winchester rifle, identical to his own, held by steady hands. The woman behind the rifle had silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, lines etched deep around sharp gray eyes that had seen their share of hardship. She wore a simple dark dress with a shawl pulled tight around shoulders still straight, despite her years. Late 50s, Jack guessed, though the frontier aged people differently. "You're bleeding all over my porch, Mr. Rivers." She didn't lower the rifle. "Yes, ma'am. Sorry about that." Jack swayed on his feet, darkness creeping at the edges of his vision. "I don't mean no trouble. Just need shelter." Storm. He felt himself falling, unable to stop his descent. The last thing he saw was the woman's face changing from suspicion to alarm as she reached out to catch him. Then, nothing. Dreams and memories blurred together in the fever. Jack was back in the prisoner camp at Andersonville, the stench of death and disease thick in his nostrils. Then he was at Gettysburg, watching boys in blue and gray cut each other to pieces across a blood-soaked field. His wife Mary, calling his name as consumption, slowly stole her away, while he was too far away to reach her, fighting someone else's war. "Easy now. You'll tear the stitches." The voice pulled him back to the present. Firm, no nonsense, with the slight lilt of someone born farther east. Jack blinked, the firelit room coming into focus around him. He lay on a narrow bed, stripped to the waist, bandages wrapped tight around his ribs. Another patch of gauze was taped to his temple. The woman from the doorway sat beside him, wiping his face with a damp cloth. Up close, he could see that beneath the silver hair and weathered skin, she must once have been beautiful. Even now there was a quiet dignity in the set of her jaw, the clear intelligence in her eyes. How long? His throat felt like sandpaper. 2 days, she replied, dipping the cloth in a basin of water. Storms still raging. You've been in and out. Fever broke this morning. Jack tried to sit up, winced as pain lanced through his side. Bullet grazed your ribs, the woman explained. Another creased your skull. You're lucky. 1/2 inch difference either way, and I'd be burying you out back when the ground thaws. Wouldn't be the first time someone said that to me. Jack managed a weak smile. Thank you, Mrs. McKenna? Sarah McKenna. She stood moving to the fireplace, where a pot hung steaming. You hungry? His stomach growled in response. Sarah returned with a bowl of stew, venison potatoes, and whatever vegetables she'd managed to preserve for the winter. Jack ate carefully, each spoonful bringing strength back to his limbs. The cabin was small, but meticulously maintained. A large fireplace dominated one wall with a rocking chair and small table beside it. Shelves lined with books and jars of preserved food. A ladder led to what must be a sleeping loft. Through a doorway, he could see a kitchen with a cast-iron stove. Everything spoke of a hard but orderly life. You live here alone, Mrs. McKenna? Jack asked between spoonfuls. I do now. Her tone discouraged further questions on that subject. What brings you to these parts, Mr. Rivers? Besides getting shot and nearly freezing to death on my doorstep. Jack hesitated. The truth was complicated and dangerous. I was escorting a Wells Fargo shipment. We were ambushed in Dead Man's Pass. The others, dead, all of them. Sarah nodded, unsurprised. That pass has earned its name many times over. She studied him with those penetrating gray eyes. Wells Fargo doesn't hire just anyone to guard their gold shipments. You, military. Once. Union cavalry. Long time ago. My husband fought for the Union, 23rd Ohio Infantry. She took his empty bowl. He always said you could spot a cavalryman by how they carry themselves even years later. Jack nodded. The war had marked them all in visible and invisible ways. You're the only survivor of a robbery, Sarah continued. Most men in your position would be in a hurry to report to the authorities. Most men haven't been framed for murder by those same authorities, Jack replied, before he could stop himself. Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't seem alarmed. I see. Then I suppose it's fortunate for you that this storm has cut us off from town. She moved to check his bandages. Sheriff Thomas won't be riding out this way until the weather clears, and that could be days yet. Jack caught her wrist, his grip gentle but firm. I'm not running from justice, Mrs. McKenna, just from men who've twisted it to serve their own purposes. Their eyes locked, measuring each other. After a moment, Sarah nodded. This country has no shortage of twisted men, Mr. Rivers. I've met my share. She pulled her wrist free. Rest now. We can discuss your situation when you're stronger. As she turned away, Jack noticed the shotgun propped against the wall near the door, the box of shells on the shelf above it. Sarah McKenna was no stranger to protecting herself. Mrs. McKenna, he called as she reached the kitchen doorway, the men who attacked the wagon. They weren't ordinary bandits. They wore black coats, had their faces covered, but they knew my name. Sarah paused her back to him. Something in her posture changed, a new tension in her shoulders. "Did they have a symbol?" she asked quietly. "An eagle with outstretched wings." Jack's blood ran cold. "Yes, silver pins on their lapels. How did you know?" When Sarah turned back, her face was carefully composed, but Jack could see the fear she was trying to hide. "Get some sleep, Mr. Rivers. It seems we have much to discuss, but morning will be soon enough." With that, she disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Jack alone with his thoughts and the crackling fire. He knew he should rest, but unease kept him awake. His saddlebags had been placed beside the bed. Reaching down, he checked that the leather pouch and document packet were still there, safely hidden in an inside pocket. The fate of many good people depended on those papers reaching the right hands. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal rattling the shutters. Jack stared into the flames, wondering if he'd brought death to this woman's door. When Jack next awoke, pale morning light filtered through the cabin windows. The storm had passed, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. He sat up, pleased to find the dizziness gone, though his side still ached fiercely. His clothes had been washed and mended, laid out on a chair beside the bed. He dressed slowly, listening to Sarah moving about in the kitchen, the clatter of pans and the rich aroma of coffee, telling him breakfast was underway. When he stood, his legs felt steady enough, and he made his way to the kitchen doorway. Sarah stood at the stove, her back to him. "There's coffee on the table," she said without turning. "You move quiet for a big man." "Force of habit," Jack replied, pouring himself a cup from the granite pot. The coffee was strong and bitter, just the way he liked it. Old habits from the war. Never quite shook them. Most didn't. Sarah turned spatula in hand and gestured to the table. "Sit. You need food if you're planning to leave today." "Am I planning to leave? Aren't you?" She placed a plate before him. "Eggs, salt, pork, and biscuits. Men like you don't usually stay in one place long." Jack couldn't argue with that assessment. He'd been drifting since Mary died, never putting down roots. But something in Sarah's tone made him look closer at her. The light revealed what darkness had hidden, the fine tremor in her hands, the shadows beneath her eyes. She hadn't slept. "You recognize the description of those men," Jack said. "The ones with the eagle pins." Sarah sat across from him with her own coffee but no food. "Yes? Care to tell me how—" She traced the rim of her cup with one finger, considering her words carefully. "They call themselves the Black Eagle Society. They've been operating in this territory for about 5 years now. Started small, buying up foreclosed farms, pressuring miners to sell claims. Now they control half the businesses in Silver Creek and most of the county officials." Including the sheriff?" Jack asked. "No, not my son." The pieces clicked into place. "Sheriff Thomas, he's your boy." Sarah nodded, pride momentarily overtaking her worry. "Thomas McKenna, been sheriff 3 years now." "And where is he?" The fear returned to her eyes. "Missing. 3 months ago he was investigating land seizures in Eagle County. Homesteaders forced out their properties, transferred to Rocky Mountain Railway within days. Thomas traced the paperwork to Judge Harmon in Denver. He rode out to meet with him and never came back." Jack set down his fork. "Judge Harrison. You know him. He contacted me 2 months ago, asked me to come to Colorado to help with an investigation into corruption. Said he had evidence against powerful men, but needed someone outside the system." Jack leaned forward. "When I reached Denver, I found out Harrison had been murdered. I was framed for it." Sarah's knuckles whitened around her cup. Then, Thomas was right. There is a conspiracy. The Black Eagles aren't just a gang of thugs, Jack confirmed. They're the enforcement arm for someone with money and power. Someone buying up land along the proposed railway route. Maxwell Thornton, Sarah supplied. Former Union general, now president of Rocky Mountain Railway. He came to Colorado after the war, used his military connections to secure government contracts. Jack nodded. The name was familiar from Harrison's letters. Thornton wants the land cheap before the railroad arrives, and values skyrocket. Anyone who won't sell gets a visit from the Black Eagles. Or disappears entirely. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. Like my Thomas. The grief in her eyes was raw, unhealed. Jack recognized it all too well. The same desperate hope he'd clung to when Mary first fell ill, before reality crushed it out of him. Mrs. McKenna, he said gently, I need to know what Thomas discovered. Did he send any messages, any documents before he disappeared? Sarah hesitated, then stood. Finish your breakfast. There's something you should see. Jack ate quickly while she went to the living room. When he joined her, she was removing a loose brick from beside the fireplace. From the hidden space, she withdrew a small packet wrapped in oilcloth. His last letter, she explained, unwrapping it carefully, arrived 2 weeks after he disappeared. No postmark. Someone must have delivered it directly. She handed Jack a folded paper worn at the creases from repeated reading. The handwriting was cramped, but legible. The words hurried, Mother, if you're reading this, something's happened to me. Don't trust Sheriff Ellis from Pine Ridge. He's one of them. Don't trust Judge Harmon either. I found proof of what they're doing. Thornton and the Black Eagles are forcing people off their land because there's gold under it. The lost Condor mine that Father spent his life searching for. They've found it, Mother, right where Father always said it would be, under Shadow Canyon, where they're laying the new tracks. There's a map with this letter. Keep it safe. If I don't return, find Jacob Swift Elk with the Ute. He knows the truth about Father's death. It wasn't consumption that took him. I love you. Be careful. They're everywhere. Thomas. Jack looked up from the letter. The map. There wasn't one. Sarah said, her voice tight. Not with the letter. Thomas must have hidden it separately, or whoever delivered this kept it. Jack's mind was racing, connecting pieces of a puzzle that had eluded him for weeks. The lost Condor. I've heard miners talk about it. Supposed to be the richest vein in Colorado, discovered by Spanish explorers who were killed by the Utes before they could return to claim it. My husband Robert spent 20 years searching for it, Sarah confirmed. Most thought he was chasing a fairy tale, but he believed until the day he died. And now Thornton believes it too, Jack murmured. Enough to kill for it. He looked at Sarah intently. Your son said your husband didn't die of consumption. Sarah's face hardened. Robert worked the mines until his lungs gave out. He died in that bed right there, coughing his life away while I watched. I was there, Mr. Rivers. I know what killed my husband. I'm sorry, Jack said. I didn't mean to question your memory. But doubt had been planted. He could see it in her eyes. Another loss, and another grief that might not be what it seemed. Jack carefully refolded the letter. I think we can help each other, Mrs. McKenna. I need to clear my name and finish what Judge Harrison started. You need to find your son. And how do we do that? The Black Eagles control everything from here to Denver. Not everything, Jack countered. Not everyone. There are still good people fighting back. Harrison had allies, in the governor's office, in the territorial legislature. We get this evidence to them, and we can bring Thornton down. Sarah studied him, measuring his words against her own desperation. And if Thomas is dead? The blunt question hung in the air between them. Jack didn't flinch from it. Then we make them pay for it. All of them. Something kindled in Sarah's eyes, not hope exactly, but purpose. She nodded once, decision made. When can you ride? Tomorrow, if you have a horse to spare. I have 2 in the barn. The storm's passed, but the trails will still be dangerous. She stood collecting the letter and returning it to its hiding place. We should leave at first light. Jack raised an eyebrow. Sarah's expression brooked no argument. You know these Black Eagles. I know the territory. And Thomas is my son. She squared her shoulders. Besides, you're still healing. You try to make it to Silver Creek alone, you'll reopen those wounds and bleed out before you're halfway there. Jack couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his lips. Sarah McKenna was a force of nature. Yes, ma'am. Their planning was interrupted by a sound that made them both freeze. The distant but unmistakable thunder of approaching horses. Jack was on his feet instantly, peering through the front window. On the road that wound through the valley below, a group of riders emerged from the tree line. Even at this distance, their black coats were distinctive against the snow. The Black Eagles, he murmured. At least 6 of them. Sarah moved to his side, her face pale but composed. How did they find you so quickly after the storm? They must have been searching the area, found the wagon remains. Jack turned to her, his expression grave. Mrs. McKenna, I need to leave. Now. These men won't hesitate to kill anyone who helps me. There's no time, she countered, moving swiftly to the rifle mounted above the fireplace. They're already on the property. She checked the Winchester with practiced hands, then reached for a box of cartridges. There's another rifle in the chest by the bed. 6-shooter, too. Jack didn't argue. He retrieved the weapons, checking that both were loaded. Is there a back way out of here? A grim smile touched Sarah's lips. My husband was a cautious man, Mr. Rivers. 20 years in mining camps taught him to always have an escape route. She moved to the kitchen, Jack following close behind. At the pantry, she pushed aside a barrel revealing a trap door set into the plank floor. Root cellar connects to an old mine shaft, she explained, lifting the heavy door. Robert extended it all the way to the back of the property. Comes out in a stand of pines about half a mile west. Jack looked at her with newfound respect. Mrs. McKenna, you are full of surprises. In this country, surprises keep you alive. She handed him a lantern. Go first. I'll gather what we need and follow. Jack was halfway down the ladder when a heavy pounding at the front door echoed through the cabin. Mrs. McKenna, a man's voice authoritative and cold. Open up county business. Sarah and Jack exchanged a look. Time had run out. Go, she whispered. I'll stall them. Sarah, go. If they find you here, we're both dead. She reached into her pocket and pressed Thomas's letter into Jack's hand. Find my son, Mr. Rivers. Before Jack could protest further, Sarah closed the trapdoor above him, plunging him into darkness, broken only by the faint glow of his lantern. Through the floorboards he heard her footsteps crossing to the front door, heard the creak as she opened it. Deputy Ellis, Sarah's voice steady and unwelcoming. What brings you out this way after a storm? Checking on outlying properties, ma'am, a man replied, the same voice that had called for Jack's surrender at the ambush. Making sure everyone weathered the blizzard. As you can see, I'm fine. Mind if we come in, getting mighty cold out here? A pause, then Sarah's reluctant agreement. Heavy boots stomped into the cabin. At least 3 men, Jack guessed. He drew his pistol, holding his breath as he listened. Quite a storm, Ellis was saying. Roads still blocked up toward Dead Man's Pass. Funny thing, though, We found tracks leading this way. Man on foot, bleeding by the look of it. Plenty of hunters get caught in these storms, Sarah replied evenly. None came this way that I saw. That's so. Footsteps moved around the cabin, searching. Mind if my men check the barn, just to be thorough? Help yourself, but remove your boots first if you're coming back inside. I don't need mud all over my floors. Jack had to admire her nerve. He could picture her standing there, straight-backed and defiant, staring down men who would kill her without hesitation. The footsteps continued their circuit of the cabin. Jack tensed as they approached the kitchen, then passed by. A cupboard opened and closed. More boots clomped across the floor above. Mrs. McKenna, Ellis's voice had hardened. I'll be direct. We're looking for a man named Jack Rivers, dangerous criminal. Killed a judge in Denver, then murdered 6 good men in a robbery yesterday. If you're harboring him, that makes you an accessory. I live alone, Deputy. Have for 5 years now. But if I see any dangerous criminals, you'll be the first to know. I certainly hope so. A meaningful pause. Be a shame if anything happened to a respectable widow like yourself, especially with your son missing and all. Jack's hand tightened on his pistol at the thinly veiled threat. Through a crack in the floorboards, he could see a pair of dusty boots standing too close to Sarah's skirts. Is there news of Thomas? Sarah's voice wavered for the first time. Not yet, ma'am, but things have a way of turning up, don't they? People too, sometimes. More footsteps as someone entered from outside. Nothing in the barn, sir, but someone's been tending those horses recently. I see. Ellis's tone was smug. Mrs. McKenna, I think we need to have a longer conversation. Perhaps you should come with us to Silver Creek. On what charge? No charge. Just some questions about your activities these past few days, and maybe about those letters your son was sending before he went on his trip. Jack could hear the fear beneath Sarah's steady reply. I need to tend my animals first. Give me an hour to make arrangements. I'm afraid we're in a hurry, ma'am. Boys, help Mrs. McKenna gather her things. The sound of a rifle being cocked cut through the tension. I don't recall asking for help, Deputy. A low chuckle. Now, Mrs. McKenna, don't make this difficult. We're just doing our job. Get out of my house. A heavy sigh from Ellis. Take the rifle. Scuffling sounds a cry of pain from Sarah. Jack was halfway up the ladder when a gunshot rang out, followed by the crash of breaking glass. More shouts, another shot. Jack burst through the trapdoor, gun raised, to find chaos in the kitchen. Sarah had shot one of the deputies who lay groaning on the floor. Another man was struggling with her for control of the rifle. Ellis, a thin-faced man with cold eyes, had drawn his pistol. Jack's shot caught Ellis in the shoulder, spinning him around. The deputy's gun discharged into the ceiling as he fell. Jack swung his weapon toward the third man who had frozen in shock. Let her go, Jack ordered, his voice deadly quiet. Now! The man released Sarah, raising his hands. She stumbled backward, still gripping her rifle, a bruise forming on her cheek where someone had struck her. Mrs. McKenna, Jack said, keeping his gun trained on the deputies, I believe it's time for us to leave. Ellis was struggling to sit up, clutching his bleeding shoulder. His eyes burned with hatred as they met Jack's. Rivers, he spat. Should have known you'd hide behind a woman's skirts. Funny, Jack replied. I see a man who needs 3 armed deputies to interrogate one widow. He gestured with his gun. Sarah, get what you need. Quickly. As Sarah gathered supplies into a satchel, Jack disarmed the men, tossing their weapons out the front door into the snow. The wounded deputy continued moaning on the floor. He needs a doctor, the third man said, looking nervously at the spreading bloodstain. Bind his wound, Jack instructed. He'll live long enough to get help. He turned to Ellis. Now I'm going to ask you once, and your answer determines whether you leave this cabin alive. Where is Thomas McKenna? Ellis glared up at him, defiant despite his pain. Go to hell, Rivers. Jack crouched down, pressing the barrel of his gun under Ellis's chin. Wrong answer. Let's try again. Thomas McKenna, the sheriff. Where is he? Jack. Sarah's voice came from behind him, tight with controlled emotion. He's stalling. There were 6 riders. Where are the other 3? The realization hit Jack like a physical blow. He straightened, moving to the window. In the distance, 3 riders were galloping toward Silver Creek, summoning reinforcements. We need to go. Now. He grabbed the saddlebags containing the vital documents and his meager possessions. Can you ride? Sarah nodded, already pulling on a heavy coat. Since before I could walk. Jack turned back to the deputies, making a quick decision. He used their own belts to bind them, then dragged the furniture to block the door once they left. That won't hold them long, he told Sarah as they hurried toward the barn. Long enough, she replied grimly. The horses were already saddled. Sarah had prepared for this possibility, Jack realized. She was proving to be far more resourceful than he'd expected. As they rode out, taking the forest path to avoid being seen from the road, Jack glanced back at the cabin. For 2 days, it had been a sanctuary, a brief respite from the violence that seemed to follow him everywhere. Now it was just another place. He'd brought destruction. I'm sorry, he said to Sarah, who rode beside him with the straight-backed posture of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle. For bringing this down on you. She gave him a sidelong glance, her face half hidden by the scarf wrapped against the cold. They were coming for me eventually, Mr. Rivers. They've been circling closer for months. Her eyes hardened. At least now I have a fighting chance to find my son. They rode in silence for a time, following game trails through the dense pines. The air was bitterly cold, but clear, the storm having scrubbed the sky to a deep, painful blue. Their breath and that of their horses rose in plumes of white vapor. Where are we headed? Sarah finally asked. Jack considered their options, none of them good. Silver Creek is the obvious choice, but they'll be watching the roads. He patted the saddlebag where he'd stowed the documents. I need to get these papers to someone trustworthy. Is there anyone in town who might help us? Someone Thomas would trust. Sarah thought for a moment. Doc Sullivan. He patched up Thomas more than once after run-ins with troublemakers. Never asked too many questions. A doctor with discretion. Good. Jack nodded. We'll approach after dark, stay off the main streets. They rode steadily through the day, stopping only to rest the horses and eat a little of the jerky Sarah had packed. The temperature dropped as afternoon waned, but the sky remained clear, the setting sun painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. As dusk gathered, they reached a ridge overlooking Silver Creek. The town sprawled along the valley floor, lights beginning to twinkle in windows, smoke rising from chimneys. To the west, the skeletal framework of a railway depot was under construction, teams of men still working by lantern light despite the cold. Thornton's new terminus, Sarah said, nodding toward the construction. Wasn't there 3 months ago? Jack studied the town through narrowed eyes. From their vantage point, he could make out the main street, the church steeple, the larger buildings that must be the hotel and saloon. The sheriff's office would be near the center of town, now occupied by one of Thornton's men, if Sarah's suspicions were correct. Your doctor, Jack asked. Where would we find him this time of evening? His office is behind his house near the church, Sarah replied. But on a cold night like this, he'll be at Henderson's saloon. Man has a weakness for whiskey and poker, Jack nodded. Then that's where we'll go. He turned to face her fully. Mrs. McKenna, once we reach town, things will get dangerous quickly. These men won't hesitate to kill us both. There's still time for you to reconsider. Sarah's expression hardened. "Mr. Rivers, those men threatened me in my own home. They've taken my son. They may have murdered my husband." She checked the rifle secured to her saddle. "I'm well past the point of reconsidering." Jack found himself admiring her steel. "All right then. We go together." He offered his hand. "But if we're riding into hell side by side, you might as well call me Jack." A ghost of a smile touched Sarah's lips as she took his hand. "Jack it is. And I'm Sarah, not Mrs. McKenna." Their hands clasped briefly, a pact formed in the gathering darkness. Then they urged their horses forward, descending toward the town, and whatever awaited them there. Neither of them noticed the solitary rider watching from a distant ridge, the silver eagle pin on his black coat catching the last light of day, before he turned his horse and galloped toward the railway camp. Silver Creek had changed since Sarah had last visited. 3 months wasn't long in the normal course of frontier life, but Thornton's influence had accelerated everything. New buildings stood half-finished along the main street, their raw timber frames stark against the snow. The saloons were doing brisk business, crowded with railway workers spending their pay. Horses and wagons crowded the muddy streets despite the late hour and biting cold. Jack and Sarah left their mounts at a small livery stable on the edge of town, paying extra for the owner's discretion. They approached on foot, keeping to the shadows between buildings. Jack had pulled his hat low and wrapped a scarf around the lower half of his face. Sarah had traded her skirts for a pair of her son's old trousers and a heavy coat that disguised her figure. With her silver hair tucked under a worn slouch hat, she could pass for a slender old man in poor light. "Henderson's is just ahead," Sarah murmured as they paused in an alley. "Corner building with the red lanterns." Jack nodded, his eyes constantly scanning the street. "I'll go in first, find Sullivan. You watch the door. If you see Ellis or any of those Black Eagle boys, signal me with 2 short whistles." "I'm not staying outside," Sarah countered. "Thomas is my son, and Sullivan knows me." "That's precisely why you shouldn't show your face. Ellis will have men watching for you." "And they'll be looking for a woman," she replied stubbornly. "Not an old prospector with a limp." She demonstrated hunching her shoulders and affecting a convincing shuffle. Jack stifled a reluctant smile. "You've done this before." A spark of something pride mischief glinted in Sarah's eyes. "When you're the only woman in a mining camp, Mr. Rivers, you learn to adapt." He conceded with a nod. "Stay close. Don't speak unless necessary. And keep your hand on that pocket pistol." The saloon was a wall of noise and warmth after the quiet cold of the night. A piano player hammered out a lively tune in the corner, nearly drowned by the din of voices, clinking glasses, and occasional bursts of laughter. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the reek of unwashed bodies. No one paid much attention to 2 more figures slipping through the batwing doors. Jack scanned the room, his experienced eye categorizing the patrons by threat level. Railway workers occupied most tables, drinking away the day's labor. Card games ran along one wall, the players a mix of locals, and the better-dressed newcomers that prosperity always attracted. 2 women in brightly colored dresses circulated among the tables, serving drinks and deflecting wandering hands. "Sullivan," Jack murmured. Sarah nodded toward a table in the far corner. Gray beard, black coat, playing poker with the banker and the assayer. The doctor was a corpulent man with a wild halo of gray hair surrounding a bald crown. His beard couldn't quite disguise the slack jowls of a heavy drinker, but his eyes were sharp as they studied his cards. A worn medical bag sat on the floor beside his chair. Evidently, he was always on call, even during his recreation. "Wait at the bar," Jack instructed Sarah. "Order a drink, but don't touch it. I'll approach Sullivan alone." Sarah complied, slouching onto a bar stool and gruffly requesting whiskey, in a credible imitation of a man's gravelly voice. Jack made his way through the crowd, timing his approach to coincide with the end of the current hand. Sullivan had just raked in a modest pot when Jack appeared at his shoulder. "Doc," he said quietly, "heard you might help a man with a bullet graze that needs looking at." The doctor glanced up, professional interest overcoming his annoyance at the interruption. "Saloon's no place for medical consultations, friend. It's a delicate matter. Might need your discretion." Understanding dawned in Sullivan's rheumy eyes. He'd clearly heard such requests before. "Very well." He gathered his chips. "Gentlemen, I'll rejoin you shortly. The call of duty, you understand." The other players grumbled good-naturedly as Sullivan heaved himself to his feet, retrieving his bag. Jack led him toward the bar, catching Sarah's eye with a slight nod. "My office is just down the street," Sullivan was saying. "We can actually dock," Jack interrupted softly. "We were hoping for something more private. Your friend at the bar there has a particular interest in this consultation." Sullivan glanced at Sarah, confusion crossing his features. Then recognition dawned, followed swiftly by alarm. "Sweet Jesus," he breathed. "You shouldn't be here. Not here." Jack cut him off. "Is there somewhere we can talk?" Sullivan hesitated only briefly. "Back door, through the kitchen. My house is behind the apothecary." They followed him through the crowded saloon, Jack keeping a watchful eye on the other patrons. No one seemed to be paying them particular attention, but that didn't mean they weren't being observed. The kitchen was hot and chaotic, two harried Chinese cooks shouting at each other as they prepared meals. They barely spared a glance for Sullivan and his companions as they slipped through to the back door. The night air was a shock after the stifling heat of the saloon. Sullivan led them along a narrow alley between buildings, then across a small yard to a modest clapboard house. He ushered them inside, lighting a lamp only after drawing the curtains. "Mrs. McKenna," he said as Sarah removed her hat, releasing her silver hair. "You're taking a terrible risk coming into town." "It's good to see you too, Howard," Sarah replied dryly. Sullivan turned to Jack, his expression wary. "And you are Jack Rivers." The doctor's bushy eyebrows rose. "The same Jack Rivers who's wanted for murder in Denver. The one Deputy Ellis has been asking about all over town." "The same," Jack confirmed, removing his hat. "Though the murder charge is manufactured." Sullivan sank heavily into an armchair, running a hand over his face. "Lord, give me strength. You two have stepped into a hornet's nest." He looked at Sarah with genuine concern. "They came to your place, didn't they, Ellis and his men?" Sarah nodded. "This morning. It didn't go well for them." "She shot one," Jack added. "I winged Ellis. By now, they'll have the whole town looking for us." Sullivan barked a short, humorless laugh. "You certainly don't do things by halves, do you?" He sighed, reaching for a bottle on a nearby table. "I need a drink before we continue this conversation." While the doctor poured himself a generous whiskey, Jack took the opportunity to examine their surroundings. The house was cluttered, but clean, the sitting room lined with bookshelves sagging under medical tomes. A desk in the corner was piled with papers and ledgers. Through an open door, he could see an examination room with a table and cabinet of supplies. "How much do you know about what's happening here?" Sarah asked once Sullivan had fortified himself. "Enough to keep my head down," the doctor replied grimly. "Thornton's railway has brought money into Silver Creek, but at a cost. Men who oppose him have accidents. Officials who question his methods are replaced. Your son was one of the few who stood against him openly." "Do you know what happened to Thomas?" The hope in Sarah's voice was painful to hear. Sullivan couldn't meet her eyes. "No, But there are rumors. Workers at the railway camp whisper about prisoners being kept at Thornton's private compound. Political enemies, troublemakers. Some say they're forced to work on the most dangerous sections of track. Slave labor, Jack said flatly. Essentially, though Thornton calls them contracted workers serving out their sentences. Sullivan's disgust was evident. The territorial governor sent an investigator last month. The man never filed a report. Because Thornton had him killed, Jack interjected. Judge Harrison, he contacted me before he died, asked me to help expose the corruption. Sullivan studied Jack with new interest. You're not just a wanted man passing through, then? No, I came to Colorado specifically to meet Harrison and gather evidence against Thornton and his Black Eagles. And now you and Sarah are both fugitives. Sullivan drained his glass. What exactly do you want from me? Sarah leaned forward. Information, Howard. Anything you know about where Thomas might be held. And a safe place to stay while we figure out our next move. The doctor considered this, stroking his beard. I can offer you my guest room for the night. As for Thomas, he hesitated. There is someone who might know more. A man who escaped from the railway camp 2 weeks ago. I treated his injuries, frostbite, malnutrition, whip marks on his back. Where is he now? Jack asked. Hiding in the church basement. Father McBride gives sanctuary to those in need, asks no questions. Can you take us to him? Sullivan glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner. Not tonight. Ellis has men watching the church since they suspect McBride's activities. Better to wait until morning, when the service brings enough people to provide cover. He stood with a groan. For now, you both need rest. You look dead on your feet. He wasn't wrong. The long ride through bitter cold after the confrontation at the cabin had drained them both. Sarah especially was showing signs of fatigue, the lines around her eyes deeper than before. The guest room is upstairs, Sullivan continued. There's only one bed, but it's better than nothing. I'll keep watch down here. Sarah looked like she might protest the sleeping arrangements, but exhaustion won out. Thank you, Howard, for everything. Don't thank me yet, the doctor replied darkly. Your troubles are just beginning. Jack woke with the first light of dawn, instantly alert. It took him a moment to place his surroundings, Sullivan's guest room sparsely furnished, but clean. He was on the floor, having insisted that Sarah take the narrow bed. Now he rose silently, muscles protesting after hours on the hard wooden boards. Sarah still slept, her silver hair spread across the pillow, her face softened in repose. She looked younger, more vulnerable, the worry lines smoothed away by sleep. Jack felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. This woman had already lost so much, her husband under suspicious circumstances, her son missing. Yet she faced each new danger with a courage that put many men to shame. He moved to the window, carefully pulling back the curtain just enough to survey the street below. Silver Creek was already stirring, merchants opening their shops, workers heading to the railway construction site. Nothing appeared immediately threatening, but Jack had survived long enough to know that danger rarely announced itself. See anything? He turned to find Sarah sitting up watching him with those sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. Just the usual morning traffic, he replied. But Ellis will have men looking for us. We can't stay in town long. Sarah nodded, rising and efficiently rebraiding her hair. We need to speak with this escaped prisoner first. If he's been in Thornton's camp, he might have seen Thomas. Agreed. Then we need to get these documents to someone who can act on them. Jack patted his coat pocket where he kept the crucial evidence. Sullivan mentioned the territorial governor sent Harrison. That suggests he might be sympathetic to our cause. The governor is in Denver, Sarah pointed out. "That's 100 miles through mountains in winter." "One problem at a time," Jack said. "First, let's find out what we can about your son." They found Sullivan in his kitchen preparing a simple breakfast of coffee and flapjacks. The doctor looked as though he'd slept poorly, dark circles under his eyes, but he greeted them with gruff hospitality. "Eat," he instructed, pushing plates toward them. "You'll need your strength. I'll take you to the church after the 8 o'clock service begins." They ate in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Jack used the time to mentally review their options, none of them good. If Thomas was being held at Thornton's compound, a direct rescue would be nearly impossible without more men and resources. The documents might be their best leverage, but only if they could get them to someone with the authority to act. "Tell me about Thornton," Jack said finally. "Not the railway baron, the man. You knew him during the war, didn't you, Doc?" Sullivan looked surprised. "How did you know that?" "You have a photograph on your bookshelf, 17th Ohio Medical Corps. I recognized Thornton from newspaper engravings." The doctor nodded slowly. "Yes, I served under him at Shiloh and Stones River. Brilliant tactician, but cold as ice. Didn't hesitate to sacrifice men to achieve objectives." "That fits with what I've heard," Jack murmured. "He was a colonel when I encountered his regiment at Missionary Ridge, known for leaving no man alive on the battlefield, enemy or his own wounded." Sarah looked between them. "You both fought for the Union. Shouldn't that make him an ally?" Jack shook his head. "The war revealed men's true natures, Mrs. McKenna. Some fought for principles, some for power. Thornton was the latter." "What happened after the war?" she pressed. "He was promoted to brigadier general for his decisive action," Sullivan answered, his tone bitter. "Used his military connections to secure government contracts for the railroads. Built his fortune on the backs of veterans who couldn't find other work. And somewhere along the way, he formed the Black Eagles," Jack added, "his private army of enforcers." "They started as his personal bodyguards," Sullivan confirmed, "former soldiers loyal to him. Now they're more like a cult with their black coats and silver pins. They operate above the law because they make the law around here." The doctor glanced at the clock on the wall. "It's time. The service will be starting soon." He went to a cabinet and returned with 2 items, a small revolver, which he handed to Sarah, and a medicine bottle he gave to Jack. "Laudanum," he explained. "If you're caught, better to have options." Jack understood the implication. A quick death might be preferable to what Thornton's men would do to them. He pocketed the bottle with a grim nod. They left through the back door, making their way through alleys toward the white-clapboard church at the end of the main street. Sullivan led them to a side entrance as the bell in the small steeple began to ring, calling the faithful to worship. "Father McBride knows you're coming," the doctor whispered as they slipped inside. "The basement entrance is behind the altar through the vestry." The church was filling with townspeople, families in their Sunday-best minors, who'd made an effort to clean up even a few of the saloon girls seeking redemption or simply respite. Jack kept his head down as they skirted the edge of the congregation. Sarah had resumed her disguise as an old prospector, shuffling beside Sullivan as if seeking the doctor's support. They reached the vestry without incident, finding a ruddy-faced priest waiting for them. "Dr. Sullivan," he greeted them in a lilting Irish brogue. "These are the friends you mentioned." "Yes, Father. This is Sarah McKenna, Sheriff Thomas's mother, and Jack Rivers." The priest's eyes widened at Jack's name, but he made the sign of the cross and nodded. "The Lord teaches us not to judge. Follow me." He led them to a small door hidden behind a curtain, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The basement was cool and damp, illuminated only by a few candles. As Jack's eyes adjusted, he made out several figures huddled on pallets along the walls, refugees from Thornton's regime. "Miguel," Father McBride called softly, "these people wish to speak with you. About the camp." A thin man separated himself from the shadows, approaching cautiously. His face was gaunt, marked by recent suffering, his hands bearing the unmistakable damage of frostbite, several fingers blackened and missing the tips. "They are not with the Eagles." His accent was Mexican, his eyes wary. "No," Sarah stepped forward, removing her hat. "I'm looking for my son, Thomas McKenna, the sheriff. He disappeared 3 months ago." Recognition flickered in Miguel's eyes. "The sheriff? Yes, I saw him." Sarah's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the basement. Jack moved closer, placing a steadying hand at the small of her back. "Where?" he asked. "When?" "At the camp, high in the mountains where they build the trestle bridge." Miguel gestured vaguely northward. 2 weeks ago, before I escaped." "Was he alive? Was he well?" Sarah's voice trembled despite her obvious effort at control. Miguel's expression held both compassion and fear. "He was alive, Senora, but not well. They keep him separate from other prisoners. He is important to them." "What do you mean?" Jack pressed. "The man with the eagle pin, the big one, with the scar, he says the sheriff knows where to find oro, gold. They question him day after day." Miguel's voice dropped. "Sometimes we hear him screaming." Sarah swayed slightly, and Jack tightened his grip on her waist, keeping her upright through sheer will. "But he does not break." Miguel continued, a note of admiration entering his voice. "He is strong, your son. The guards, they respect him, even as they hurt him." "Where exactly is this camp?" Jack asked, his mind already calculating distances, resources needed. 2 days' ride north in Shadow Canyon, where the new track crosses the river. Miguel shuddered at the memory. "It is a bad place. Many men die building the bridge. When we are too weak to work, they take us to the tunnels. No one returns from the tunnels." "The lost Condor mine," Sarah whispered. "They're using prison labor to dig it out." Jack nodded grimly. "Forced labor saves money and keeps the operation secret." He turned back to Miguel. "How many guards at the camp?" 20, maybe 30 Black Eagles, and Thornton himself comes sometimes with more men." "How did you escape?" A flash of pride crossed Miguel's ravaged features. "I was assigned to the kitchens. One night, storm comes, big snow like the world is ending. The guards, they stay inside. I take my chance, walk through the blizzard." He held up his damaged hands. "I pay the price, but I am free." Father McBride stepped forward. "I believe that's enough questions. Miguel needs rest." "One more," Jack insisted. "The sheriff, did he give you any message, anything at all?" Miguel hesitated, glancing at the priest as if seeking permission. Then he reached into his shirt and withdrew a small object, a battered tin star. "He give me this the night before I escape. Say if I make it to Silver Creek, find a woman with silver hair and eyes like his. Give her this, tell her, the eagle flies at dawn." Sarah reached for the badge with trembling fingers. "That's Thomas's star," she confirmed, running her thumb over the dented metal. "But what does the message mean?" Jack was about to respond when a commotion erupted upstairs. The church door banging open, raised voices, the congregation's surprised murmurs. Father McBride's face paled. "Someone's coming." Heavy footsteps crossed the floor above their heads, heading purposefully toward the vestry. Jack drew his revolver, positioning himself between the stairs and Sarah. "Is there another way out?" he asked urgently. The priest shook his head. "Only the coal chute, but it's too small for a man." "Go back to the others," Jack instructed Miguel. "If things go wrong, remember what you saw. Someone needs to tell the truth about what's happening here." The footsteps reached the vestry. A voice they recognized, Deputy Ellis, called out, "Search everything! They're here somewhere." Sullivan moved to Jack's side, his own pistol drawn. "I'll stay. Get Sarah out if you can." Jack nodded, surprised and grateful for the doctor's courage. He turned to Sarah, who had already tucked her son's badge safely away and drawn the small revolver Sullivan had given her. "Stay behind me," Jack murmured. "If I fall, run. Don't look back." The door at the top of the stairs burst open, lantern light spilling down into the basement. Jack raised his gun, prepared to fire at the first black coat that appeared. But it wasn't Ellis who descended the stairs. The man who entered the basement wore a well-cut suit beneath his heavy winter coat, not the uniform of the Black Eagles. He was tall and distinguished, with silver at his temples and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. Most surprisingly, he came alone and unarmed. "Dr. Sullivan," he said, his voice cultured, carrying the faint accent of Old Boston. "Father McBride, I apologize for the intrusion." "Governor Morrison," Sullivan replied, lowering his gun in confusion. "What are you doing in Silver Creek?" Jack kept his weapon trained on the newcomer trust, not coming easily after decades of betrayal. "This is the territorial governor." "Indeed." The man's intelligent eyes assessed Jack coolly. "And you, I presume, are Jack Rivers, the man Judge Harrison sent for before his untimely death." "How do you know that?" "Because I sent Harrison to investigate Thornton in the first place." Governor Morrison turned his attention to Sarah. "And you must be Mrs. McKenna. Your son spoke highly of you when we met. A fine lawman, one of the few in these parts not in Thornton's pocket." Sarah stepped forward. "Do you know where he is?" "Not precisely, but I intend to find out." The governor looked back to Jack. "I believe you have something that belongs to me, Mr. Rivers, documents that Harrison was collecting." Jack didn't lower his gun. "How do I know you're not working with Thornton?" "A reasonable question." Morrison reached slowly into his coat and withdrew a letter. "Harrison sent me this before he died. It mentions you by name, says you're the only man he trusted to deliver the evidence if something happened to him." Jack took the letter with his free hand, scanning it quickly. The handwriting matched Harrison's previous correspondence. The details were correct. "Why come in person?" he asked, still suspicious. "Why not send the cavalry?" "Because Thornton has friends in Washington," Morrison replied grimly. "Powerful friends who've invested in his railway. I needed absolute proof of his crimes before I could act officially. That's what Harrison was gathering evidence of: land theft, corruption, murder. And what I'm carrying," Jack confirmed, finally lowering his weapon. "Names, dates, financial records. Enough to hang Thornton 10 times over. Then we have a common cause." The governor glanced toward the stairs. "But we don't have much time. Deputy Ellis and his men are searching the church as we speak. I've temporarily diverted them, but they'll be here soon." "What do you propose?" Sullivan asked. "I have a private rail car at the Silver Creek Depot. My presence here is officially a tour of the new railway construction. Thornton's invitation, ironically enough, I'm scheduled to visit his work camp tomorrow." "Shadow Canyon," Sarah said, "where he's holding my son." Morrison nodded. "My car is guarded by territorial marshals loyal to me, not Thornton. If we can get you there, you'll be under my protection." Jack exchanged looks with Sarah. It could be a trap, but they had few options. What about these people? Sarah gestured to Miguel and the other refugees. They've suffered under Thornton's regime. They need protection too. Father McBride will continue to shelter them, the governor assured her. And once Thornton is removed, they'll be free to come forward without fear of reprisal. A shout from upstairs indicated the search was intensifying. They were running out of time. "How do we reach your rail car?" Jack asked. "Ellis has men everywhere." Morrison smiled thinly. "Through the front door. Sometimes the boldest approach is the least expected." The governor's plan was audacious but simple. He would leave the church with Jack and Sarah as his assistants in full view of the congregation and Ellis's men. The deputy wouldn't dare interfere with the territorial governor's business, especially with witnesses present. Sullivan would remain behind to maintain his cover and continue helping those Thornton had victimized. He embraced Sarah briefly before they parted. "Find Thomas," he whispered, "and come back to tell me about it." Jack shook the doctor's hand, surprised by the emotion that welled up. In another life, they might have been friends instead of desperate allies in a corrupt territory. Governor Morrison led them up the stairs and through the vestry, straightening his tie as if preparing for a public appearance. Jack and Sarah followed, doing their best to look like proper assistants despite their trail-worn appearance. The church was still full, the service interrupted by Ellis's search. The deputy stood near the altar questioning the frightened pastor. 4 black eagles flanked him, their hands resting on their weapons. Morrison strode confidently down the central aisle, nodding politely to the congregation. "Deputy Ellis," he called, "I believe your men are disrupting these good people's worship." Ellis turned, his face darkening when he saw Jack and Sarah. His hand moved toward his gun. "Sir, those 2 are wanted fugitives," he began. "Nonsense," Morrison cut him off smoothly. "These are my assistants, helping me prepare for tomorrow's inspection. I'm afraid you've been misinformed." Ellis hesitated, caught between his orders from Thornton and the political reality of challenging a governor in public. "Sir, we have reports that they attacked law enforcement officers." "I find that extremely difficult to believe," Morrison interrupted again, his voice hardening. "Perhaps you'd like to telegraph Denver and confirm their identities with my office, though that might delay the inspection I'm scheduled it to conduct at Mr. Thornton's behest." The implied threat was clear. Ellis backed down, though rage simmered in his eyes. "Of course, Governor. My apologies for the confusion." "Quite understandable. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have preparations to make." Morrison continued down the aisle, Jack and Sarah following closely. The congregation parted before them, whispers following in their wake. Jack kept his hand near his concealed weapon, half expecting Ellis to forget protocol and open fire. But they reached the church doors without incident, emerging into the bright winter morning. A carriage waited at the bottom of the steps, the territorial seal emblazoned on its door. 2 stern-faced marshals stood guard, hands resting openly on their sidearms. "My carriage will take us to the depot," Morrison murmured as they descended. "Once we're in my private car, we can speak freely." They had nearly reached the carriage when a new complication arose. A group of riders appeared at the end of the street, 6 men in black coats led by a powerfully built figure whose very presence seemed to command attention. "Thornton." The governor breathed, his composure slipping for the first time. The railway baron rode directly toward them, his men fanning out behind him. He was older than Jack had expected, perhaps 60, with a leonine mane of white hair and piercing blue eyes, set in a face weathered by decades of frontier life. A cavalry saber hung at his side, an anachronism in the age of repeating rifles, but somehow fitting for a man who carried himself like a general surveying his domain. "Governor Morrison," Thornton called, his voice carrying easily down the street. What a pleasant surprise. I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow's inspection. I arrived early to get a proper sense of Silver Creek, Morrison replied smoothly. Unfiltered by official tours. Thornton's gaze shifted to Jack and Sarah, his eyes narrowing slightly. And these would be my assistants. They are helping me prepare my report on the railway's progress. How thorough of you! Thornton dismounted with the ease of a much younger man. I don't believe I've had the pleasure of meeting your assistants. Jack met the railway baron's gaze, directly seeing the cold calculation behind the courteous facade. This was a man accustomed to measuring others as tools or obstacles, nothing more. Thomas Wilson, Jack lied smoothly, and this is my colleague, Mrs. Reynolds. Thornton stepped closer, close enough that Jack could see the scar running from his right temple to his jaw, a souvenir from some long-ago battle. You seem familiar, Mr. Wilson. Have we met before? I don't believe so, sir. I would remember. Thornton's smile didn't reach his eyes. Indeed, you would. He turned back to the governor. Since you're here early, perhaps you'd join me for lunch at my home. I can brief you on tomorrow's inspection. Another time, General, Morrison replied. We have much to prepare. I insist. Thornton's tone hardened almost imperceptibly. In fact, I've received some disturbing reports about fugitives in the area. For your safety, I'd be remiss if I didn't provide you with proper security during your stay. The threat was clear. Thornton suspected their identities and wasn't about to let them leave with the governor. Jack tensed, ready for violence. The two marshals by the carriage sensed the change in atmosphere, moving their hands to their weapons. Behind Thornton, his black eagles did the same. Sarah stepped forward suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. General Thornton, before we accept your kind invitation, perhaps you could answer a question that's been troubling the governor. Thornton's eyebrows rose. Certainly, Mrs. Reynolds. The governor has been concerned about reports of missing persons in Silver Creek. Most recently, Sheriff Thomas McKenna. Sarah's voice remained steady despite the danger. As a leader in this community, surely you've heard something about his whereabouts. A flash of recognition crossed Thornton's face as he looked more closely at Sarah. Then his expression settled into one of practiced sympathy. Ah, you must be the sheriff's mother. Mrs. McKenna, is it not Reynolds? Sarah didn't flinch. Where is my son Thornton? The street had gone deathly quiet. Townspeople who had been exiting the church froze on the steps. The Black Eagles moved their horses closer, hands on their weapons. Thornton sighed as if genuinely regretful. I had hoped to break this to you more gently, Mrs. McKenna. Your son was investigating criminal elements in Eagle County. He was ambushed on his return journey. We found his horse, his badge, but no body. He shook his head sadly. The mountains are unforgiving in winter. I fear the worst. Liar! Sarah hissed, her hand moving toward the hidden pocket where she kept her revolver. Jack caught her wrist, stopping her before she could make a fatal mistake. Sarah, not here. Thornton's facade of sympathy vanished. Governor, it appears your assistants are indeed the fugitives my men have been seeking. This man is Jack Rivers, wanted for murder in Denver, and Mrs. McKenna here assaulted a deputy just yesterday. Morrison stepped between them and Thornton. These people are under my protection, General. If there are charges against them, they'll be addressed through proper legal channels. Of course, Thornton agreed with cold courtesy. My men will escort all of you to my home, where we can sort this unfortunate situation out. That won't be necessary, Morrison countered. My marshals are quite capable of providing security. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. On one side, Thornton and his 6 Black Eagles. On the other, the governor 2 marshals, and Jack and Sarah. The odds weren't favorable, especially in the middle of a town Thornton effectively controlled. Then Deputy Ellis emerged from the church leading his 4 men down the steps. The balance shifted further 10 against 5. Jack's mind raced, calculating Angle's possibilities, likely casualties. They were surrounded, outgunned. Even if he and the marshals managed to take down some of Thornton's men, Sarah and the governor would likely be killed in the crossfire. "It seems we're at an impasse," Thornton observed, almost amused. "But I hold the advantage of numbers and territory. Come with me peacefully, and I give you my word as a gentleman that no harm will come to any of you while we resolve this misunderstanding." Before anyone could respond, a new sound cut through the tense silence, the piercing whistle of an approaching train. Morrison smiled slightly. "That would be the eastbound express from Denver. Right on schedule." Thornton frowned. "This doesn't concern the railroad, Governor." "On the contrary, that train carries something you should find quite interesting." Morrison checked his pocket watch. "The 10th Cavalry Regiment Buffalo soldiers returning from Apache campaigns in Arizona, stopping here to resupply before continuing to Fort Riley." Jack had heard of the Buffalo soldiers' Negro cavalry units who had distinguished themselves fighting Indians on the frontier. Formidable troops, and unlikely to have any loyalty to Thornton. "You're bluffing," Thornton said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Am I?" Morrison gestured toward the depot where smoke was now visible above the rooftops. "Feel free to verify for yourself." The distant clanging of the train bell lent credence to the governor's claim. Thornton hesitated, recalculating his options. "This changes nothing," he said finally. "Even federal troops would need proper authority to interfere in territorial business, which is why I took the precaution of having the regiment temporarily assigned to my command." Morrison's smile was cold. "The wonders of the telegraph general, so useful for coordinating with Washington." It was a masterful bluff, if indeed it was a bluff. Jack couldn't be certain, but the confidence in Morrison's stance suggested he might actually have arranged such contingencies. Thornton's jaw tightened, but he was too experienced a strategist to force a confrontation he might not win. "Another time then, Governor. We'll continue this discussion during tomorrow's inspection." "I look forward to it." Morrison opened the carriage door, gesturing for Jack and Sarah to enter. "Good day, General." As they climbed into the carriage, Jack kept his eyes on Thornton. The railway baron's mask of civility had slipped, revealing the ruthless commander beneath. Their gazes locked for a moment, mutual recognition passing between 2 men who had seen the worst of war and its aftermath. "This is not over," Thornton's eyes promised. "I'm counting on it," Jack's replied. The carriage door closed, and the marshals mounted their horses to escort them to the depot. As they pulled away, Jack saw Ellis and the Black Eagles gathering around Thornton, clearly receiving new orders. "Will the cavalry really help us?" Sarah asked once they were out of earshot. Morrison's confident expression faded. "The 10th is indeed passing through, but they're not under my command. That was a calculated risk to buy us time." "Time for what?" Jack asked, already suspecting the answer. "To escape," Morrison replied grimly. "Thornton won't be fooled for long. Once he confirms the cavalry has no orders regarding him, he'll move against us with everything he has." "Then we need to reach your private car quickly," Jack said, "and hope it's as secure as you claim." The governor nodded, worry lines deepening around his eyes. "It will protect us temporarily, but we can't remain in Silver Creek. Thornton controls too much here." "Where then?" Sarah demanded. "My son is being held at Thornton's camp. I won't leave without him." "The inspection tomorrow may be our only chance," Morrison said thoughtfully. Thornton expects me to arrive with an official delegation. He'll have security, but it will be restrained respectful of my position. A Trojan horse, Jack mused. We enter under the guise of an inspection, then find a way to locate and free Thomas. And gather final proof of Thornton's crimes, the governor added. Enough to bring federal troops in officially and end his reign for good. Sarah looked between them, hope warring with skepticism in her eyes. Just the three of us against Thornton's entire operation. 4, said a new voice from the opposite seat. Jack's gun was in his hand, instantly aimed at the figure who had somehow concealed himself beneath a traveling blanket in the corner of the carriage. The man raised his hands slowly, his weathered face impassive. "Who the hell are you?" Jack demanded. "Jacob Swift Elk," the man replied calmly. "Ute Scout, friend of Thomas McKenna." His dark eyes found Sarah's. "And I know where they're keeping your son, Mrs. McKenna." The governor's private rail car was opulent compared to the rough frontier accommodations Jack had grown accustomed to. Polished mahogany paneling lined the walls, brass fixtures gleamed in the lamplight, and plush leather chairs offered comfort rarely found west of the Mississippi. A pot-bellied stove radiated welcome heat against the winter chill, and crystal decanters of amber liquor sat on a small side table. Yet, despite these luxuries, tension filled the air as Jack kept his revolver trained on Jacob Swift Elk. The Ute Scout sat calmly, hands resting on his knees, his weathered face impassive beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He wore a curious mix of white man's clothing and traditional Ute garments, wool trousers, and a cavalry jacket over a beaded vest with moccasins instead of boots. "How did you get in here?" Governor Morrison demanded, clearly unsettled by the breach in his security. "Your guards watch for men coming, not men already inside," Swift Elk replied with the hint of a smile. "I was here before you arrived." "Wait," Jack pressed his finger still on the trigger. "What's your interest in this?" Sarah moved closer to the scout, studying his face. "You mentioned my son. You know Thomas?" Swift Elk nodded. "Since he was a boy. Your husband Robert brought him to our camp many times when he searched for the lost mine." Recognition dawned in Sarah's eyes. "I remember now. You guided them into the mountains." "Yes. Robert McKenna was a good man. He respected our ways, our sacred places." Swift Elk's expression darkened. "Not like Thornton, who desecrates our land and works men to death, searching for gold." Jack lowered his weapon slightly, sensing no immediate threat from the man. "You said you know where they're holding Thomas." "At the high camp in Shadow Canyon, where the railway crosses Eagle River on the Big Trestle." Swift Elk made a cutting motion with his hand. "The camp has 2 parts. Workers' tents on the north side, guarded cabins to the south. Thomas is kept in the last cabin nearest the cliff." The specificity of this information convinced Jack that Swift Elk was genuine. Still, caution was warranted. "How do you know this?" he asked. "I have watched the camp for many weeks. The Ute know ways to move unseen through our mountains." The scout's eyes shifted to the governor. "After Thomas disappeared, I followed Thornton's men, saw them take others who asked too many questions." Morrison poured himself a drink with a slightly trembling hand. "Judge Harrison," Swift Elk nodded. "They brought him to the camp. 2 days later, they took him into the mine tunnel. He never came out." Sarah gasped softly, and Jack felt a cold fury building inside him. Harrison had been a good man, dedicated to justice. He deserved better than to die in a hidden mine tunnel at Thornton's orders. "What about the other prisoners?" Jack asked. "How many are there? 50, maybe 60 in the workers' camp. Men who refused to sell their land, or who spoke against Thornton. Some criminals from territorial prisons promised freedom, if they work. Swift Elk's gaze grew distant. Many die. The bridge is dangerous work. When men fall, they are not replaced in the count. And the mine? Sarah asked. Is it real, the lost condor? Swift Elk nodded solemnly. Real, yes. My people have always known of the yellow metal beneath Shadow Canyon. Our ancestors declared it taboo, the place of angry spirits. Those who entered seeking gold never returned. Yet Thornton found it, Morrison mused. He found the entrance when blasting for the railway line. Now he digs day and night with men who have no choice. Jack's tactical mind was already assessing the situation. What kind of defenses does the camp have? 20, perhaps 30 Black Eagles with rifles. Fence around the workers' camp. Guard towers with lanterns. Swift Elk drew a rough map on the condensation of the window. One road in. Steep cliffs on 3 sides. The trestle bridge crosses here, still being built. A natural fortress, Jack observed grimly. Difficult to approach undetected, nearly impossible to escape. Unless you know the old Ute hunting trails. Swift Elk traced another route on the glass. A narrow path leads down from the ridge above. Dangerous in winter, but possible. Governor Morrison had been listening intently. This is valuable intelligence, Mr. Swift Elk, but it doesn't change the overwhelming odds against us. Even with my marshals, we'd be outnumbered and outgunned. We don't need to overpower them, Jack countered. Just create enough confusion to get to Thomas and escape. The inspection tomorrow gives us our opening. Assuming Thornton still honors it after today's confrontation, Morrison pointed out. He will, Jack said confidently. Men like Thornton are predictable in certain ways. He won't risk insulting the territorial governor openly. It would raise too many questions in Denver and Washington. He'll welcome your inspection party while planning to eliminate us once we're isolated at the camp. A cheerful assessment, Morrison said dryly, but accurate. Jack turned back to Swift Elk. Can you guide us in through these hunting trails if necessary? The scout nodded. I can show you the way. But first, there is something you should know. He reached inside his jacket and withdrew a folded document yellowed with age. This belongs to Sarah McKenna now. Sarah took the paper with a questioning look. As she unfolded it, her eyes widened. This is a mining claim, she said, scanning the document. Filed by Robert in 1865 for a site in Shadow Canyon. Your husband found the lost condor 20 years ago, Swift Elk confirmed. But he saw what gold fever did to men, how it poisoned their spirits. He made an agreement with my father, then chief of our band. The claim would protect the canyon from other white miners, but the gold would remain in the ground. That's why he kept searching all those years, Sarah whispered, understanding dawning in her eyes. He was maintaining the pretense, keeping others away from the real location. A noble sentiment, Morrison interjected, but that claim is likely expired by now. Swift Elk shook his head. Robert McKenna renewed it every year until his death. Then Thomas continued. The last renewal was filed 4 months ago. Which means the McKennas, not Thornton, legally own the richest gold mine in Colorado, Jack concluded. No wonder he wants Thomas to break. He needs him to sign over the claim. Or die so Thornton can manipulate the records, Morrison added. With Thomas gone and the paperwork lost, Thornton could assert his railway's right to the land through the government grants. Sarah's hands trembled as she carefully refolded the precious document. This is why Robert died, isn't it? Not from mine, dust in his lungs. Swift Elk's expression confirmed her suspicion. 5 years ago, Thornton approached him about railway routes through Eagle County. During the survey, they discovered the old Spanish markers for the mine. Robert refused to sell his claim or reveal its location. 2 weeks later, he became ill. Poisoned, Jack said flatly. Small amounts over time. Symptoms like consumption. Your husband knew Mrs. McKenna, but he chose to protect you and Thomas by keeping silent. Sarah's face had gone pale, but her eyes burned with a terrible clarity. And now, they have my son. Yes, but Thomas is strong. He has not broken despite their methods. Jack watched Sarah, carefully concerned about how she was processing these revelations. The grief of losing her husband had been complicated by learning he'd been murdered. Now her son's life hung in the balance. To his admiration, she straightened her shoulders, tucking the claim document securely inside her coat. Then we must reach him before they realize he'll never give them what they want. Agreed, Jack said. He turned to Morrison. Governor, we need to formalize our plan for tomorrow's inspection. How many men can you bring without arousing suspicion? My security detail consists of 4 marshals. More would seem excessive for a routine visit. 6 against 30, Jack calculated. Not ideal, but we've managed with worse odds. Swift Elk cleared his throat. There will be help inside the camp. Not all who wear black coats serve Thornton willingly. This was an unexpected development. Explain, Jack prompted. 3 moons ago, a Black Eagle came to our camp wounded. He had tried to help prisoners escape and been shot for his trouble. We healed him. In return, he has been our eyes in the camp, passing messages when possible. Swift Elk's expression remained neutral, but Jack sensed there was more to this story. This man, can he be trusted? With your life, the scout replied simply. He wears their coat, but not their heart. Governor Morrison checked his pocket watch. The train to Shadow Canyon departs at dawn. My inspection is scheduled for 10 o'clock. He looked at each of them in turn. We should rest while we can. Tomorrow will test us all. As if to punctuate his words, the rail car suddenly lurched, the sound of coupling mechanisms engaging, indicating they were being attached to a train. Jack moved swiftly to the window, pushing aside the velvet curtain. On the platform, he could see railway workers preparing an engine for departure. More concerning were the half-dozen Black Eagles patrolling the depot, watching the governor's car with predatory intensity. It seems Thornton is eager to expedite your inspection, Jack observed grimly. Morrison joined him at the window, his expression troubled. They're moving us out tonight, without my authorization. Your authorization is a formality in Thornton's territory, Swift Elk said. He controls the railway, the telegraph, the roads. And now he's ensuring we reach the camp on his schedule, not ours, Jack added, limiting our preparation time. Sarah moved to the other window, her hand instinctively reaching for her concealed revolver. Should we try to disembark, make our own way there? Jack considered their options. Fleeing now would mean abandoning the relative safety of the governor's rail car and the authority of his office. They'd be vulnerable, hunted through unfamiliar territory in the dead of winter. No, he decided. We stick with the original plan, just accelerated. Thornton wants to control the situation, but that works both ways. By bringing us to his camp, he's also bringing us to Thomas. The whistle blew a shrill sound cutting through the winter air. With a jerk and the hiss of steam, the train began to move, carrying them inexorably toward Shadow Canyon and whatever awaited them there. The journey through the mountain passes took several hours, the powerful locomotive laboring against steep grades and snow-covered tracks. Inside the governor's railcar, they used the time to plan Swift Elk sketching detailed maps of the camp and surrounding terrain on paper provided by Morrison. The workers' compound is here, the scout explained, marking a rectangular area. Surrounded by fence guard towers at each corner. Beyond the railway construction extends along the canyon rim to the trestle bridge. "And Thomas?" Sarah asked, leaning forward intently. Swift Elk indicated a small structure set apart from the others. "This cabin built against the cliff face. 2 guards at all times." Jack studied the layout, committing it to memory. "What about the mine entrance? Here at the base of the cliff, heavy timber door with iron banding, always guarded." The train swayed around a sharp curve, momentarily throwing them against each other. Through the windows, Jack could see they were traversing a narrow ledge carved into a mountainside, a sheer drop of hundreds of feet, just yards from the tracks. "Thornton chose his location well," Morrison observed. "Defensible, isolated, accessible only by the railway he controls." "Or by paths only the Ute remember," Swift Elk added. "This was our hunting ground for many generations before white men came." Jack returned to the practical matter at hand. "The inspection gives us access, but we'll be watched closely. We need a distraction at the critical moment." "The bridge," Sarah suggested, pointing to the trestle on the map. "Thomas's letter mentioned it was being built where the railway crosses Eagle River. If something were to happen there, sabotage." Morrison looked uncomfortable. "That would risk lives." "Not necessarily," Jack countered. "A controlled incident, something that looks dangerous but actually endangers no one. Enough to draw guards away from Thomas's cabin." Swift Elk nodded approvingly. "The Ute who work in the camp could help. They keep small bundles of black powder hidden, taken grain by grain from the blasting supplies." "Good," Jack said. "Now we need to coordinate timing and signals." They spent the next hour refining their plan, accounting for contingencies and potential complications. Jack was impressed by Sarah's practical contributions. Grief and shock had hardened into resolute determination to save her son. As the planning concluded, Morrison poured drinks for everyone except Swift Elk, who declined. "To success," the governor said, raising his glass. "And to justice long overdue." Jack sipped the fine bourbon, appreciating its smooth fire after weeks of raw frontier whiskey. Through the windows he could see the landscape growing more rugged, the forests giving way to stark cliffs and deep chasms. They were entering the heart of the Rockies, where men like Thornton carved empires from stone and human suffering. "You've been quiet," Sarah observed, taking the seat beside him as Morrison and Swift Elk conversed at the other end of the car. "Just thinking," Jack replied. "Weighing odds, considering angles." And he met her steady gaze. "It's risky. A lot can go wrong." "I know." Sarah's hand found his, her grip surprisingly strong. "But we have to try. He's my son." Jack nodded, understanding completely. Family was worth any risk, any sacrifice. Though his own had been lost long ago, he remembered that bone-deep certainty that you would walk through fire for those you loved. "We'll get him out," he promised, squeezing her hand. "Whatever it takes." Something passed between them in that moment, an unspoken connection forged through shared danger and purpose. Jack felt it like a physical current, saw the recognition in Sarah's eyes. In another time, another place. The train's whistle shattered the moment, signaling their approach to a destination. Jack released her hand and moved to the window, squinting into the gathering dusk. "Shadow Canyon," Swift Elk announced, appearing silently beside him. "We have arrived." The camp sprawled across a natural shelf midway up the canyon wall, illuminated by dozens of work lights that cast long, grotesque shadows against the cliff face. The railway spur ended at a crude platform where supply wagons were loaded and unloaded. Beyond it, Jack could see the compound Swift Elk had described a fenced area containing rows of canvas tents, guard towers at each corner, equipped with searchlights that swept the perimeter. Further along the shelf, wooden structures housed what appeared to be offices, barracks, and storage buildings. Work crews moved between them, their forms silhouetted against the lights. Some free men, others clearly prisoners by their shuffling gait, and the guards that accompanied them. Dominating the far end of the camp was the trestle bridge, a massive wooden structure still under construction, extending across a dizzying chasm where the Eagle River had carved its path hundreds of feet below. Even from a distance, Jack could see men working on the span, tiny figures against the immensity of the canyon. "Impressive," Morrison murmured as they stood on the platform after disembarking. "And terrible. Built on blood and broken promises," Swift Elk said softly. They were met by a delegation of black eagles led by a tall, powerfully built man with a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw. The same man Miguel had described, the one who personally interrogated Thomas. "Governor Morrison," the scarred man greeted them with a salute that seemed more mocking than respectful. "Colonel Blackwood, head of security for Rocky Mountain Railway. General Thornton sends his regrets that he couldn't meet you personally. He'll join us for the inspection tomorrow morning." Morrison returned the greeting with the practiced diplomacy of a career politician. "Colonel, we appreciate the accommodation, though the change in schedule was unexpected." "Safety concerns," Blackwood replied smoothly. "After the incident in town this morning, General Thornton felt it prudent to expedite your visit." His cold gaze swept over Jack, Sarah, and Swift Elk. "I see your assistants have accompanied you." "Of course. I rely on their expertise." Morrison's tone remained pleasant but firm. "I understand quarters have been prepared for us." "Yes, Governor, if you'll follow me." Blackwood led them along a well-trodden path toward a cluster of cabins separate from both the workers' compound and the main administrative buildings. The strategic separation wasn't lost on Jack. They were being isolated away from both prisoners and regular staff. "Your marshals will be accommodated in the adjacent cabin," Blackwood explained, gesturing to Morrison's security detail, who followed with their luggage. "General Thornton has arranged a special dinner in your honor at 8. Until then, please make yourselves comfortable." The cabin was well appointed by frontier standards, clean bedding, a roaring fire, coal lamps providing warm light. But Jack immediately noted the lack of windows facing the workers' compound or the mine entrance. Their view was deliberately restricted to the administrative area and the incomplete bridge. "We're being managed," he observed quietly, once Blackwood had departed. "Shown only what Thornton wants us to see." "As expected," Morrison replied, removing his coat. "But we anticipated this." Swift Elk, the scout, moved to the doorway, peering out at the gathering darkness. "The guards change at midnight. That is our window." "And our inside man?" Jack asked. "He will come to the governor's dinner. Watch for a man with a silver chain visible at his collar." Jack nodded, then turned to Sarah, who stood at the small window, her gaze fixed on the distant cabin where her son was supposedly held. "Are you ready for this?" he asked gently. She turned to him, her face composed, despite the emotion he knew must be churning beneath the surface. "I've been ready since the day he disappeared." The next few hours passed in tense waiting. They used the time to rest and prepare checking weapons and reviewing their plan. Jack cleaned his revolver with practiced efficiency, the familiar ritual calming his mind, as it had before countless battles during the war. At precisely 8 o'clock, a black eagle arrived to escort them to dinner. They followed him to the largest building in the administrative area, a 2-story structure with actual glass windows, a luxury in this remote outpost. Inside a dining room had been prepared a long table set with fine china and crystal that seemed bizarrely out of place in the frontier mining camp. Half a dozen Black Eagle officers were already present standing when Morrison entered out. All wore the same black coat and silver eagle pin, their expressions uniformly impassive. Jack searched for the man Swift Elk had described, someone with a silver chain at his collar, but saw no obvious sign. "Governor Morrison," a cultured voice called from the head of the table. "Welcome to Shadow Canyon." General Maxwell Thornton cut an imposing figure in his tailored black suit. His white hair and beard were immaculately groomed, and his posture remained military straight, despite his age. The scar on his face, earned in some long-ago battle, only added to his commanding presence. "General Thornton," Morrison replied, with a diplomatic nod. "Thank you for your prompt hospitality." A ghost of a smile touched Thornton's lips. "I believe in efficiency, Governor. Why wait for tomorrow when we can begin establishing a productive relationship tonight?" He gestured to the table. "Please be seated. All of you." They took their places, Jack positioning himself where he could observe both the door and Thornton. Sarah sat across from him, her composure remarkable, given that she was dining with the man who had likely ordered her husband's death and now held her son prisoner. Swift Elk remained standing near the wall, as if by mutual understanding that he would not be seated at the table. "Mr. Swift Elk," Thornton called, noticing this arrangement. "Surely you'll join us, I insist." The scout hesitated, then took a seat at the far end of the table, his expression inscrutable. Servants or prisoners assigned to service roles, Jack suspected, brought in platters of food, venison potatoes, fresh bread that must have required considerable effort to prepare in this remote location. Wine was poured crystal glasses, glinting in the lamplight. "You've built quite an operation here, General," Morrison observed as the meal commenced. "Impressive progress, given the difficult terrain." "American ingenuity and determination," Thornton replied. "The railway is the future of this territory, Governor. Within 5 years, these mountains will yield their treasures to Denver, Chicago, and beyond." He raised his glass. "To progress?" The officers dutifully echoed the toast. Jack brought his glass to his lips but didn't drink, noting that Sarah and Swift Elk did the same. "I understand you've had some labor difficulties," Morrison said casually, cutting into his venison. "Shortage of skilled workers in such a remote location must be challenging." Thornton's expression didn't change, but something hardened in his eyes. "We've implemented innovative solutions. Contracted labor, primarily. Men who owe a debt to society working it off in service to their country's expansion." "Prisoners," Sarah said, speaking for the first time, her voice deceptively calm. "Rehabilitation through meaningful work, Mrs. McKenna." Thornton met her gaze directly. "Surely you approve of giving men a second chance." "That depends on whether they have a choice." Tension crackled between them. Jack shifted slightly, ready to intervene if necessary. "Choice is often a luxury, especially on the frontier," Thornton replied. "But I'm sure you understand that having lived in these mountains for so many years, your husband certainly did." Sarah's knuckles whitened around her fork. "Yes, he understood the difference between opportunity and exploitation." Thornton's smile remained fixed, but his eyes grew colder. "Robert McKenna was a visionary in his way. Ahead of his time, perhaps. A shame he never lived to see his greatest ambition realized." "Which ambition was that, General?" Jack interjected, drawing Thornton's attention away from Sarah. "Why the discovery of the lost Condor mine, Mr. Rivers?" "It was his life's obsession, as I'm sure Mrs. McKenna can attest." Thornton turned back to Sarah. "Did you know your husband was close, so very close, when illness took him?" I know a great deal about my husband's work, Sarah replied evenly, including the legal documentation of his claims. A momentary flash of anger crossed Thornton's face before his mask of civility returned. Indeed, documentation is so important in establishing rightful ownership. Unfortunately, records can be misplaced in territorial offices, especially when their custodians meet with unfortunate accidents. The threat was thinly veiled. Morrison set down his fork, abandoning the pretense of casual dinner conversation. General, let's speak plainly. I've received disturbing reports about your operations here, allegations of forced labor, illegal land seizures, even violence against those who oppose your expansion. Slander from competitors and malcontents. Thornton dismissed with a wave of his hand. I invited you here to see for yourself the reality of our work. Tomorrow's inspection will disprove these baseless accusations. Will it? Morrison pressed. Will I be allowed to speak with the workers freely, examine their living conditions, review their contracts? Within reasonable parameters, of course. Security must be maintained. Jack watched this verbal sparring with growing certainty that Thornton had no intention of allowing a genuine inspection. This dinner, the entire visit, was theater a performance, before their inevitable elimination, once they'd seen exactly what Thornton wanted them to see. As if confirming his thoughts, Thornton continued, In fact, I've prepared a special demonstration for tomorrow. We'll be setting charges to extend the railway tunnel, the final connection that will complete our route through Shadow Canyon. Quite spectacular and perfectly timed for your visit. How thoughtful, Morrison replied dryly. Dinner continued with superficially polite conversation, masking deadly undercurrents. Jack observed the Black Eagle officers trying to identify Swift Elk's contact, but none displayed a silver chain or any sign of being anything other than Thornton's loyal enforcers. As the meal concluded, Thornton rose to his feet. Gentlemen, Mrs. McKenna, I regret that business calls me away. Colonel Blackwood will see to your needs for the remainder of the evening. We'll commence the inspection at 10 tomorrow morning. He moved to the door, then paused. I suggest you rest well. The mountain air can be taxing for those unaccustomed to it. After Thornton departed, the atmosphere remained tense but slightly less formal. Coffee was served, and the Black Eagle officers engaged in subdued conversation among themselves. No sign of our contact, Jack murmured to Swift Elk as they stood near the fireplace pretending to admire a mounted elk head. He will come, the scout assured him. Perhaps not as expected, but he will come. Their speculation was interrupted when Colonel Blackwood approached, his scarred face impassive. Governor, if you've finished, I'll escort you back to your quarters. As they prepared to leave, one of the Black Eagle officers, a younger man with a lieutenant's insignia, accidentally bumped into Jack, spilling coffee on both their sleeves. My apologies, the man said quickly, producing a handkerchief. As he helped Jack dab at the stain, something pressed into Jack's palm, a small, folded paper. No harm done, Jack replied casually, pocketing the note as he made a show of examining his sleeve. The young officer nodded, then stepped back, his hand briefly touching his collar, where a silver chain was just visible beneath his uniform. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They were escorted back to their cabin in silence, Blackwood leaving them with a curt reminder that the compound was patrolled throughout the night for their safety. Once alone, Jack immediately checked for listening devices or spy holes, a paranoid habit from the war that had saved his life more than once. Finding nothing obvious, he withdrew the folded paper and opened it carefully. The message was brief, written in a cramped hand. Thomas alive, but weakened. Execution ordered after tomorrow's demonstration. Mine tunnel rigged to collapse during inspection. Black Eagles have orders to eliminate all witnesses. Midnight, at the South Guard post. Bring the claim documents." Jack passed the note to the others, watching their expressions as they read it. "It's a trap," Morrison said immediately. "They're trying to lure us out with information about Thomas." "Perhaps," Swift Elk allowed, "or perhaps our ally risks his life to warn us." Sarah studied the note again. "It mentions the claim documents. How would they know we have them unless Thomas told them, or unless Thornton's men found them at your cabin after we left?" Jack countered. He paced the small room, weighing options, assessing risks. "Either way, our plan hasn't changed. We move at midnight, but we proceed with extreme caution." The hours until midnight crawled by with excruciating slowness. They extinguished most of the lamps, leaving just enough light to prepare their equipment, while maintaining the appearance of a cabin whose occupants had retired for the night. Jack checked his revolver for the third time, then the knife in his boot. Beside him, Sarah loaded the small derringer Sullivan had given her, her hands steady despite the stakes. Morrison seemed more nervous, repeatedly checking his pocket watch and peering through the curtains at the compound beyond. "It's time," Swift Elk finally announced, his internal clock apparently requiring no timepiece. They donned their coats and moved to the door, where Jack held up a hand, signaling for silence. Pressing his ear to the wood, he listened for any sign of guards posted outside. Hearing nothing, he carefully turned the handle. The door didn't budge. He tried again, applying more pressure. The door remained firmly shut. "We're locked in," he whispered. Sarah's eyes widened. "From the outside," Jack nodded grimly. "It seems our host doesn't trust us to stay put." Swift Elk moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. "2 guards at the corner of the building. More patrolling the path." "We need another way out," Morrison said, a note of panic entering his voice. "If that note was accurate, we have only hours before Thornton springs his trap." Jack examined the cabin more carefully. It was well built, with no obvious weaknesses in the walls or door. The windows were small, but not barred, designed to keep out cold rather than prevent escape. The floor was solid plank wood, and the ceiling. He looked up, noticing a hatch that likely led to a storage space in the rafters. "There," he pointed. "Swift Elk, give me a boost." With the scout's help, Jack reached the hatch and pushed it open, pulling himself up into the dark space above. A moment's exploration with his hands confirmed his suspicion. The roof wasn't fully sealed against the rafters. There was space to maneuver and potentially a way out. He dropped back down. "We can get through the roof. It won't be easy, but it's possible." "Then what?" Morrison asked. "We'll be exposed, visible to any guard who looks up." "We go over the ridgeline," Swift Elk said, "between buildings, staying in shadows. The South Guard post is beyond the administrative area, near the trail that leads down to the river." Sarah was already moving a table beneath the hatch. "Let's not waste time debating. Thomas's life depends on this." One by one, they climbed through the hatch into the cramped space beneath the roof. Jack used his knife to pry loose several shingles, creating an opening just large enough for them to squeeze through. The bitter cold hit them immediately, the winter wind cutting through their clothing as they emerged onto the sloped roof. The compound spread out below them, illuminated by work lights and the occasional sweep of searchlights from the guard towers. In the distance, the incomplete trestle bridge loomed against the star-filled sky, its massive wooden supports casting long shadows across the canyon. Jack led the way, crawling along the peak of the roof to minimize their silhouette. At the rear of the cabin, where shadows were deepest, he lowered himself to the ground, then helped the others down. For several tense minutes they crouched in the darkness, watching the patrol patterns of the guards. When a momentary gap appeared, Swift Elk signaled, and they darted to the shelter of a storage shed. Building by building, Shadow by shadow, they made their way toward the southern edge of the compound. The south guard post was a small wooden structure positioned at a natural choke point, where the path narrowed between the cliff face and a steep drop. Two black eagles stood outside, rifles at the ready, occasionally stamping their feet against the cold. "Now what?" Morrison whispered as they concealed themselves behind stacked lumber. "We can't simply walk up to them." Before anyone could respond, a commotion erupted near the workers' compound. Shouts followed by the sharp crack of a rifle shot. The guards at the post immediately turned their attention toward the disturbance. "Our diversion," Swift Elk said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "The Ute workers know their part." As the guards conferred briefly, one of them jogged toward the compound to investigate, leaving a single man at the post. Jack was about to suggest they take advantage of the reduced security when the remaining guards suddenly crumpled, falling silently to the ground. A figure emerged from the shadows of the guard post, beckoning urgently to them. As they approached, Jack recognized the young Black Eagle officer from dinner, the one who had passed him the note. "Lieutenant Cross," the man introduced himself hurriedly. "There's no time for explanations. Follow me." "Where's Thomas?" Sarah demanded. "Being moved as we speak. The execution has been moved up. Thornton suspects. A rescue attempt." Cross glanced nervously toward the continuing disturbance. "That diversion won't last long." "How do we know this isn't a trap?" Morrison questioned. Cross pulled aside his collar, revealing a silver chain from which hung a tarnished sheriff's badge, Thomas McKenna's star. "Thomas gave me this," he said to Sarah. "Told me to find his mother if anything happened to him. Said to tell you the eagle flies at dawn, the same phrase Miguel was supposed to deliver." Sarah's hand went to her mouth. "Thomas's message. It's really him. Mrs. McKenna, your son saved my life when I was falsely accused of theft in Silver Creek last year. I joined the Black Eagles as an informant at his request." Cross's expression was pained. "I've done terrible things to maintain my cover, but I draw the line at murder. They're going to kill Thomas tonight, then stage an escape attempt to explain his death." "Take us to him," Jack said, his decision made. Cross nodded and turned toward a narrow path that hugged the cliff face leading away from the main compound. They followed in single file, the sheer drop to their right, a constant reminder of the peril of their position. After several hundred yards, the path widened slightly, revealing a small cabin built directly against the rock wall. The isolated structure Swift Elk had identified earlier. A single guard stood at the door, his attention focused on the distant commotion. "Wait here," Cross whispered, then emerged from the shadows, approaching the guard with casual authority. "Relief time, Jenkins. Colonel wants you at the main gate." The guard looked surprised but didn't question the order. As he turned to leave, Cross struck him from behind with the butt of his revolver, catching the unconscious man before he could fall and make noise. "Quickly!" he urged them forward. Jack helped drag the unconscious guard into the shadows, then followed the others to the cabin door. Cross produced a key, his hands shaking slightly as he worked the lock. The door swung open, revealing a small, sparsely furnished interior lit by a single oil lamp. A man was slumped on a narrow cot against the far wall. His wrists shackled to a ring bolted into the rock. His face was bruised and swollen, his clothes filthy, but there was no mistaking the family resemblance. "Thomas!" Sarah gasped, rushing to her son's side. Thomas McKenna raised his head slowly, as if the simple movement required immense effort. His eyes, the same gray as his mother's, widened in disbelief. "Mother?" His voice was a hoarse whisper. "You shouldn't be here. It's not safe." "Neither should you," she replied, examining his restraints. "We're getting you out." Cross moved forward with another key, quickly unlocking the shackles. "Can you walk?" Thomas nodded, though the effort clearly pained him. "Been saving my strength. Knew this day would come." His gaze found Jack. "Who's this?" "Jack Rivers," Sarah explained. "He's been helping me find you." Recognition flickered in Thomas's eyes. "The gunman Harrison sent for. Did you bring the evidence?" Jack nodded. "Safe with the governor. Morrison is here." Thomas looked stunned. "Then Thornton will move tonight. You've forced his hand." As if confirming his words, the camp bell began to ring an alarm, not the usual shift change signal. Shouts echoed across the compound, the searchlights from the guard towers sweeping with new urgency. "They've discovered the missing guard," Cross said, drawing his revolver. "Or your escape from the cabin. Either way, we need to move now." Thomas struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his mother. "Not the main road. They'll have it blocked." "The Ute Trail," Swift Elk said. "It's our only chance." Cross nodded. "I'll lead them away from your escape. Buy you some time." "They'll kill you when they realize you helped us," Thomas warned. A sad smile crossed the lieutenant's face. "Better to die for something that matters than live serving monsters." He handed Thomas a revolver. "East path leads to a rock fall that conceals the trailhead. May your God go with you." Before anyone could object, Cross slipped out the door, disappearing into the night. Jack took charge, his combat instincts kicking in. "Governor, help Sarah with Thomas. Swift Elk, lead the way. I'll cover our retreat." They emerged from the cabin to find the entire compound in chaos. Searchlights swept wildly, guards ran between buildings, and in the distance, gunshots echoed sporadically. Swift Elk led them along the cliff path, away from the main compound, moving as quickly as Thomas's weakened condition allowed. The narrow trail hugged the canyon wall, occasionally requiring them to press their backs against the rock, to sidle past particularly precarious sections. Behind them, the alarm bells continued to ring, and Jack could hear voices shouting commands, organizing search parties. It wouldn't be long before they discovered which way the fugitives had gone. After what seemed an eternity, they reached the rockfall Cross had mentioned, a tumble of boulders partially blocking the path. Swift Elk navigated through them with practiced ease, revealing a hidden trail that descended steeply toward the canyon floor. "This way?" he urged. "The path is difficult, but will lead us to safety." Thomas stumbled, nearly falling. "I can't," he gasped. "Too weak. You should go on without me." "Not a chance," Sarah said fiercely. "We came for you, and we're leaving with you." Jack assessed their situation grimly. The steep trail would be challenging even for someone at full strength. In Thomas's condition, their progress would be dangerously slow. "Governor," Jack decided, "you and Swift Elk help Thomas down the trail. Sarah and I will hold them off as long as possible, then follow." "Jack, no," Sarah protested. "That's suicide." "It's our only chance," he countered. "Someone has to slow them down or none of us will make it." Before she could argue further, the beam of a searchlight swept over the rockfall, followed by a shout of discovery. Their position had been compromised. "Go," Jack ordered, pushing Morrison and Swift Elk toward the hidden trail. "Get Thomas to safety. Get the evidence to Denver. Make this count." The governor hesitated only briefly before nodding. With Swift Elk's help, he half-carried Thomas down the steep path, disappearing into the darkness below. Jack positioned himself behind a large boulder, his revolver ready. Sarah took cover nearby, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "You should have gone with them," he told her. "My place is here," she replied simply. "With you." The first black eagles appeared on the path, moving cautiously, rifles at the ready. Jack waited until they were fully exposed, then fired. His shot found its mark, sending one man tumbling over the cliff edge with a distant scream. The others dove for cover, returning fire that ricocheted off the rocks around them. For several minutes, they held their position, each of them carefully placing shots to maximize their limited ammunition. But more Black Eagles arrived, their superior numbers allowing them to advance steadily despite casualties. "We need to fall back," Jack said as bullets chipped stone inches from his head. "Make our way down the trail while we still can." Sarah nodded, firing a final shot from her position before scrambling toward the hidden path. Jack provided covering fire until she was safely beyond the rockfall, then began his own retreat. He had almost reached the trailhead when a bullet caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him around. He staggered, nearly losing his footing on the treacherous edge. Another shot kicked up dirt at his feet. "Jack!" Sarah had reappeared, firing her last bullets to drive back their pursuers. He stumbled toward her, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Together, they plunged onto the steep trail, using trees and rocks as handholds to control their descent in the darkness. Behind them, angry shouts and the beams of lanterns indicated their pursuers had found the trailhead. Shots rang out, bullets splintering bark and ricocheting off rocks. But the Black Eagles were firing blind into the darkness. Jack's wounded arm throbbed with each heartbeat, warm blood soaking his sleeve and making his grip slippery. He focused on each step, each handhold, knowing a single misstep meant death on the rocks below. They had descended perhaps 100 feet when a new sound reached them, the thunder of hooves on the canyon floor. Riders with torches were galloping along the riverbank, moving to cut off their escape route. "Thornton's sending men around," Jack gasped. "They'll reach the bottom before we do." Sarah's face was pale but resolute in the faint moonlight. "Then we don't go to the bottom, we find another way." As if in answer to her determination, Swift Elk materialized from the darkness ahead, gesturing urgently toward a narrow crevice in the cliff face. "This way," he whispered. "Cave system runs beneath the canyon. Old Ute refuge." They followed him into the crevice, which widened into a low tunnel beyond. The absolute darkness was disorienting, but Swift Elk moved confidently, leading them deeper into the mountain. Behind them, faint voices and the glow of lanterns indicated their pursuers had reached the crevice entrance. Jack paused, drawing his knife. "Keep going," he told Sarah. "I'll collapse the entrance." While Swift Elk led Sarah deeper into the cave, Jack worked feverishly, using his knife and bare hands to dislodge keys supporting rocks from the narrow passage. His injured arm screamed in protest, but desperation gave him strength. The first Black Eagle appeared at the entrance just as Jack removed the final supporting stone. With a rumble that seemed to shake the mountain itself, the passage collapsed, sending a cloud of dust billowing into the cave. Jack staggered backward, coughing and disoriented. The cave was plunged into absolute darkness, the sounds of cursing and frustration from the Black Eagles now muffled by tons of rock. "Sarah!" he called, suddenly fearful that she might have been caught in the collapse. "Here," came her reply from further within the cave. "Are you all right?" He followed her voice, his outstretched hands eventually finding hers. "For now, but they'll find another way in. These mountains are riddled with caves and old mine shafts." "Then we keep moving," she said, her grip on his hand tightening. "Thomas, the governor, and the evidence are safely ahead with Swift Elk. That's what matters." Jack nodded in the darkness, though she couldn't see it. "That's what matters," he echoed, wondering if they would live to see the justice they had fought for, or if this dark cave would become their tomb. As if reading his thoughts, Sarah's hand found his face, her touch gentle, despite the dire circumstances. "We're not finished yet, Jack Rivers." Before he could respond, a new sound reached them, the distant rumble of explosions from the direction of the camp. The mine tunnel, Jack realized. Thornton's detonating it early. With all the evidence inside, Sarah added grimly. The mountains seemed to shudder around them, dust and small stones raining down from the unseen ceiling. The explosions continued growing in intensity. They're using all the charges, Jack said, destroying everything. But why? Sarah's voice was puzzled. The inspection isn't until morning. The answer came to Jack in a flash of horrified understanding. Because Thornton knows his plan has failed. He's eliminating all evidence, the mine, the prisoners, everything. He's cutting his losses and running. Thomas, Sarah began, fear evident in her voice, is with the governor and Swift Elk, Jack reminded her. Our best chance is to find them and get as far from this mountain as possible before dawn. As they moved deeper into the cave system, guided only by Swift Elk's earlier passage, and their own desperate hope, the mountain continued to shake with distant explosions. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing not just against Thornton's men, but against the mountain itself, as it threatened to become their grave. The cave was a world of absolute darkness. Jack and Sarah moved carefully through the narrow passages, guided only by touch and the faint sounds of water dripping somewhere in the distance. The mountain continued to rumble ominously above them, punctuated by occasional tremors that sent loose stones clattering down from unseen heights. Jack's injured shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, the warm wetness of blood still seeping through his makeshift bandage. The bullet had passed clean through missing bone, and Major Vessel's lucky, but far from ideal in their current predicament. The cold underground air numbed the pain somewhat, but also brought with it the risk of fever, and worse, if they couldn't find their way out soon. "We need light," Sarah whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. Her hand remained firmly clasped in his, a lifeline in the darkness. Jack fumbled in his pockets with his good arm, eventually producing a small tin matchbox. "I have a few matches left. Need to use them wisely." He struck one against the rough cave wall, the sudden flare momentarily blinding after so long in darkness. The yellow light revealed a low, winding tunnel stretching ahead of them, its walls glistening with moisture. The floor was relatively flat, but strewn with rocks fallen from the ceiling, making each step treacherous. "Swift Elk said the cave system runs beneath the canyon," Sarah recalled, squinting in the matchlight. "There must be multiple exits." "Assuming the explosions haven't collapsed them all," Jack added grimly, as the match burned down to his fingers. He shook it out, plunging them back into darkness. "But you're right. These mountains are like Swiss cheese, riddled with natural caves and old mine workings." They continued forward, Jack striking a match every 100 paces or so to check their surroundings and look for side passages or signs of Swift Elk's passage. The air grew noticeably cooler and damper as they descended deeper into the mountain, the sound of dripping water becoming more pronounced. "We must be nearing the river level," Sarah observed after they had been walking for what seemed like hours. "The Eagle River cuts through the base of the canyon." And as if confirming her words, the next match revealed that their tunnel was widening, the ceiling rising higher. More significantly, a faint bluish glow became visible ahead, too steady to be a lantern, too diffuse to be a torch. "Moonlight." Jack breathed hope, surging through him. There must be an opening. They quickened their pace, moving toward the ghostly illumination. The passage curved sharply, then opened into a vast underground cavern. Jack's last match revealed a breathtaking sight, a cathedral-like space, where centuries of water had carved the limestone into fantastic columns and curtains of stone. The blue glow filtered down from high above, where a narrow fissure in the cavern roof admitted the light of the full moon. "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered, her face upturned to the distant moonbeam. "But not an exit," Jack said, trying to temper his disappointment. The fissure was hundreds of feet above them, far beyond reach. "Look!" Sarah pointed to the far side of the cavern where the moonlight reflected off a dark, smooth surface. Water. They made their way carefully across the uneven cavern floor toward what proved to be a small underground lake, its black water perfectly still mirroring the stalactites hanging from the ceiling. A narrow stone shelf formed a natural path along one edge of the water. The river must have an underground channel through here, Jack reasoned, which means it leads somewhere. Or nowhere, Sarah countered, but she was already moving along the stone shelf following the water's edge. Still, it's our best option. They continued in silence for a time, the moonlight fading behind them as they entered another tunnel where the underground stream narrowed and deepened. The darkness closed in again, but now they had the sound of flowing water to guide them. Jack found himself acutely aware of Sarah's presence beside him. Her measured breathing, the rustle of her clothing, the occasional brush of her arm against his. In the few days since their paths had crossed, this silver-haired widow had shown more courage and resilience than most men he'd fought alongside during the war. There was something remarkable about her, a quiet strength that drew him even as it commanded his respect. "Tell me about Thomas," he said, partly to distract himself from his thoughts and the pain in his shoulder. "What kind of man is your son?" Sarah was silent for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. "Stubborn," she finally said with a hint of pride in her voice. "Like his father. Robert always said Thomas had more principles than sense, but he meant it as a compliment. Thomas couldn't stand by and watch injustice even as a boy. That's how he became sheriff. The previous sheriff was killed during a bank robbery. Thomas was his deputy. The town council wanted to bring in someone more pliable, but the people insisted on Thomas." Her voice softened. "He was only 25, but he'd already earned their trust." "And made enemies," Jack added, thinking of Ellis and the Black Eagles. "Any man worth his salt makes enemies, Mr. Rivers. It's the nature of those enemies that reveals his character." Jack couldn't argue with that assessment. A man could indeed be judged by those who hated him, perhaps even more accurately than by those who loved him. "What about you?" Sarah asked after a moment. "Your enemies seem particularly determined." Jack considered deflecting the question as he usually did when people pried into his past. But something about the darkness, the isolation, the shared danger, it loosened the habitual guards around his history. "I wasn't always a hired gun," he admitted. "After the war, I tried to live quietly. Bought a small ranch in Nebraska Territory with my army pay. Married a local girl, Mary. Started building something I thought would last." He paused, the familiar ache of old grief rising in his chest. Then the Sioux War broke out in '75. The army was rounding up friendlies and forcing them onto reservations. A group of Lakota families fled the soldiers crossed our land. They were starving, half of them women and children. "You helped them," Sarah guessed. Jack nodded, forgetting she couldn't see him in the darkness. "Gave them food shelter for the night. Let them rest their horses." The next day, a cavalry patrol rode in, young lieutenant eager to make his name. He'd been tracking those families for days. The memory was still sharp enough to cut. "He accused me of harboring hostiles, demanded I turn them over. When I refused, things escalated." "You fought the army?" Sarah sounded shocked. "Not intentionally. The lieutenant tried to force his way into my barn. There was a struggle, his pistol discharged. One of his men was killed." Jack's voice had gone flat, emotionless. "They burned my ranch, took me in chains to Fort Robinson. I was court-martialed, sentenced to hang for treason. But you escaped. Mary sold everything we had left to bribe a sympathetic guard. I made it across the Missouri. But the army put a price on my head. Been running ever since. And Mary, Jack's throat tightened. Consumption. 2 winters later. I couldn't even attend her funeral. Sarah's hand found his in the darkness, squeezing gently. I'm sorry, Jack. The simple human contact, the genuine compassion in her voice, it breached defenses he'd maintained for years. After that, I stopped caring much what happened to me. Took whatever jobs came along, built a reputation with a gun. Figured I'd die bloody sooner rather than later. Yet here you are, risking everything to help strangers. Judge Harrison wasn't a stranger. He saved me from a lynch mob in Cheyenne years back. When he sent word he needed help, Jack shrugged. Some debts you can't ignore. And now? Sarah's question hung in the darkness between them. After this is over, if we survive. Before Jack could form an answer, a new sound reached them, voices echoing through the tunnel ahead, too distant to distinguish words, but definitely human. Company, Jack whispered, drawing his revolver despite the pain it caused his injured shoulder. They froze, listening intently. The voices grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable splash of someone moving through shallow water. Then a faint glow appeared around the bend in the tunnel ahead, lantern light. Jack pulled Sarah into a narrow side passage, positioning himself in front to shield her. His gun hand was steady, but he knew he had few shots left, and their position was far from ideal. "Jack Rivers," a familiar voice called. "Mrs. McKenna, are you there?" "Swift Elk," Sarah called back, relief evident in her voice. The Ute Scout appeared around the bend, a small lantern held high illuminating his weathered face, and the 2 figures behind him, Thomas McKenna still looking weak but upright, and Governor Morrison. "Thank God," the governor exclaimed. "We feared you were lost in the collapse." Sarah rushed forward to embrace her son, who swayed slightly but returned her hug with fierce intensity. "Mother, you shouldn't have come for me. The risk was mine to take," she interrupted firmly, "as you would have done for me." Swift Elk approached Jack, his sharp eyes noting the blood-soaked sleeve. "You are wounded." "It's nothing," Jack dismissed, though the pain suggested otherwise. "How did you find us?" "The old ones taught us the paths beneath the mountains," the scout replied enigmatically. "When we heard the explosions, I knew Thornton would destroy the evidence. This way offered our only chance." "But Thornton's gone completely mad," Morrison added, his cultured voice echoing oddly in the cave. "He's demolishing the entire operation, the camp, the bridge, everything. We saw it from a viewpoint further up the tunnel. The whole mountainside is coming down." "With all the prisoners still in the compound?" Jack asked, already knowing the answer. Thomas nodded grimly, his face pale in the lantern light. "No witnesses left to testify. That's been Thornton's method from the beginning." Jack felt sick at the thought of those men guilty of nothing but standing in the way of Thornton's ambitions, buried alive or crushed beneath falling timber and stone. "What about your man, Lieutenant Cross?" "Dead." Thomas replied, grief evident in his voice. "Shot while creating a diversion for our escape. He gave his life willingly." "And the evidence?" Sarah asked. "The documents proving Thornton's crimes." Morrison patted his coat. "Safe, along with your husband's mining claim. If we can reach Denver, we have enough to bring Thornton to justice." "If," Jack emphasized, "Thornton won't give up easily. Even now he'll be sealing off every escape route, hunting for survivors." Swift Elk raised the lantern, illuminating the tunnel ahead. "The water path leads to the outer canyon. 2 miles more, perhaps. But we must hurry, the river rises with snow melt each night." "Then we go now," Jack decided, holstering his revolver. "Thomas, can you manage?" The young sheriff straightened determination overriding his physical weakness. "Lead the way, Mr. Rivers." Their progress was slow but steady, following the underground stream as it gradually widened and deepened. The tunnel's roof lowered in places, forcing them to duck, while in others it soared beyond the reach of their lantern light. The air grew noticeably fresher, carrying a hint of pine and snow, tantalizing evidence that they were approaching the outside world. Jack kept his focus on the path ahead, but his mind was working through their next moves. Even if they reached the canyon safely, they'd be miles from any settlement in midwinter, with Thornton's men undoubtedly searching for them. Thomas was in no condition for a long journey, and Jack's own wound was sapping his strength with each passing hour. His thoughts were interrupted by a new sound ahead, a low, constant roar that grew steadily louder as they advanced. Rapids, Swift Elk identified it, where the underground river joins the Eagle. The tunnel began to slope downward more steeply, the footing becoming treacherous on water-slicked stone. The roar intensified until conversation became difficult. Then abruptly, the passage opened onto a breathtaking sight, a vast underground grotto where their stream plunged as a waterfall into a larger river below the combined waters, churning through a final tunnel toward daylight, visible as a gray smudge in the distance. The Eagle River. Swift Elk confirmed, holding the lantern high to illuminate the grotto. "It will carry us out of the mountain." Jack assessed the situation quickly. The drop to the river was about 20 feet into what appeared to be a deep pool before the water rushed toward the exit tunnel. Dangerous, but potentially survivable. "Can everyone swim?" he asked, raising his voice above the roar. Morrison looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Theoretically." "It's our only option," Jack said, already removing his gun belt and the heavier items from his pockets. "The current will be strong. Stay together, try to keep your head above water, and let the river do the work." Sarah helped Thomas prepare her movements efficient, despite the evident fear in her eyes. The young sheriff was barely staying on his feet, days of captivity and torture having taken their toll. Jack knew the icy river would be a terrible shock to his weakened system, but they had no alternative. "I'll go first," Jack decided, moving to the edge where the stone shelf ended above the pool. "Morrison, you and Thomas follow. Sarah and Swift Elk last." Before anyone could object, he lowered himself to a sitting position at the edge, legs dangling. The pain in his shoulder flared as he braced himself with his good arm. "Jack!" Sarah called, moving quickly to his side. In the lantern light, her face was composed, but her eyes betrayed her concern. "Be careful." He managed a grim smile. "Always am." Then he pushed off, plummeting toward the dark water below. The impact drove the air from his lungs, the cold so intense it felt like a physical blow. For a terrifying moment, he sank beneath the surface, disoriented, his wounded arm nearly useless as he fought his way back up. He broke the surface, gasping immediately, caught in the powerful current that swept him toward the exit tunnel. Treading water awkwardly, he turned back to look up at the ledge where the others waited. "It's clear," he shouted. "Jump toward the center." One by one, they followed Morrison with evident reluctance but surprising composure, Thomas with grim determination, Sarah with quiet courage. Swift Elk went last, pausing only to extinguish the lantern before diving in with the fluid grace of someone born to wilderness. The current gathered them like scattered leaves, sweeping them into the exit tunnel, where the roof lowered alarmingly close to the water's surface. Jack fought to keep his head up, painfully aware that a submerged rock or log could kill any of them instantly at this speed. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, their progress marked only by the steadily increasing light as they approached the exit. Jack caught glimpses of the others, Morrison clinging to a floating branch, Thomas supported by his mother's swift elk, swimming powerfully despite the current. Then, with startling suddenness, they were out-ejected from the mountain into the main canyon, where the Eagle River ran wide and relatively calm between towering cliffs. The winter air felt almost warm after the frigid underground stream, the gray pre-dawn light dazzling after hours of darkness. Jack struggled toward the nearest shore, his strength waning, as blood loss and cold took their toll. The others followed Morrison, helping Thomas, while Swift Elk assisted Sarah. They collapsed on a narrow gravel beach, shivering violently, but alive. "We made it," Morrison gasped, water streaming from his expensive coat. "Part way," Jack corrected, already scanning their surroundings for threats. The canyon stretched before them, its walls rising hundreds of feet on either side. Dawn was approaching the eastern sky, lightening perceptibly. Soon, they would lose the cover of darkness. "Where are we?" Sarah asked, wringing water from her hair as she knelt beside Thomas. Swift Elk oriented himself, studying the canyon walls. 5 miles downstream from the camp. The railway follows the river 2 miles further down, where the canyon widens. "And Thornton?" Thomas asked, his voice weak but clear. "If he survived his own demolition, he'll be heading for the railway," Jack reasoned. "It's his only way out of these mountains quickly." "Then so must we," Morrison declared. "I have resources waiting in Denver, federal marshals, telegraph connections to Washington. Once we reach civilization, Thornton's reign ends." Jack wasn't so sure. Men like Thornton had contingency plans, powerful friends, ways of disappearing or reinventing themselves. But he kept these doubts to himself. Morrison's confidence was useful for the moment. "Can you walk?" he asked Thomas. The young sheriff nodded, struggling to his feet with his mother's help. "Not quickly, but yes." "Good man." Jack felt a surge of respect for Thomas McKenna. Despite everything he'd endured, the sheriff's spirit remained unbroken. "Swift Elk, what's our best route?" The scout gestured downstream. "Follow the river. The canyon widens 3 miles ahead, where an old trapper's trail climbs to the plateau above. From there, we can reach the railway, where it emerges from the mountains." Jack considered this, mentally calculating distances and Thomas's condition. "How far to the nearest settlement once we reach the railway?" "Silver Creek is 20 miles east," Thomas supplied. "But Thornton controls it completely." "Junction City lies 30 miles west," Swift Elk offered. "Smaller, but the railway maintenance crews are based there. They would have telegraph connections." "Then that's our destination," Jack decided. He turned to Morrison. "Governor, once we reach the railway, you and Thomas should continue to Junction City with the evidence. Sarah, Swift, Elk, and I will create a diversion if necessary." "A noble plan," came a cold voice from the rocks above them, "but ultimately futile." They spun toward the sound, Jack reaching instinctively for his missing revolver. On a ledge 20 feet above the beach stood Colonel Blackwood, his scarred face twisted in a triumphant smile. Behind him, at least a dozen Black Eagles aimed rifles down at the exhausted fugitives. "Did you really think Thornton would fail to secure all escape routes?" Blackwood asked conversationally. "He's been hunting these mountains for 20 years. He knows every cave, every stream, every possible path." Jack's mind raced, seeking options where none seemed to exist. They were unarmed, exhausted, exposed on the open beach with the river at their backs. "The game is over," Blackwood continued. "Throw down any weapons and surrender. Perhaps the general will be merciful." "Like he was to the men in the camp." Thomas challenged, his voice stronger than his body. "The ones he buried alive, rather than leave witnesses." Something ugly flickered across Blackwood's face. "Casualties of progress, Sheriff," History won't remember their names, only the empire Thornton built. History is written by the survivors, Morrison interjected, drawing himself up with all the dignity his sodden appearance allowed. As territorial governor, I order you to stand down and submit to arrest for murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. Blackwood's laugh echoed off the canyon walls. Your authority means nothing here, Governor. In these mountains, Thornton is the only law. He gestured to his men. Take them, alive if possible, but I won't weep over corpses. The Black Eagles began descending toward the beach, moving with the confidence of predators who know their prey is cornered. Jack stepped forward, positioning himself between the gunmen and his companions, knowing it was a futile gesture, but unable to simply surrender. Jack? Sarah's voice was low, meant for his ears alone. The claim document. It's still in my coat. He glanced at her, not understanding the significance in this moment of crisis. Robert always said the Ute legends were true, she continued urgently, that the mountain itself guards the gold. That's why he left it undisturbed. Swift Elk's eyes widened in sudden understanding. The water curse, he murmured. The old ones spoke of it. Before Jack could question this cryptic exchange, Blackwood's patience ended. Enough stalling. Take them now. The Black Eagles rushed forward, rifles trained on the small group. Jack tensed, preparing for a desperate last stand, when Swift Elk suddenly raised his arms to the sky and began chanting in his native tongue a haunting rhythmic incantation that echoed strangely in the canyon. Blackwood laughed. Savage superstitions won't save you, old man. But Swift Elk continued undeterred. Sarah joined him, pulling the mining claim from her coat and holding it high. By right of claim and blood, she called out, her voice carrying a strange authority. We command the spirits of Shadow Canyon to rise. Jack thought, perhaps they'd both gone mad from stress and exposure. Then he felt it a vibration beneath his feet. Subtle at first, then growing stronger. The river's surface began to ripple oddly, not from wind or current, but from something deeper. Blackwood felt it too, his mocking smile faltering. What trick is this? No trick, Swift Elk replied, lowering his arms. The curse. A low rumble filled the canyon building rapidly to a roar that drowned all other sounds. Jack looked upstream and felt his blood turn cold. A wall of water was surging toward them, a flash flood carrying boulders, trees, and debris. The dam! Thomas realized, his eyes wide. Thornton's explosions must have breached the railway dam upstream. Run! Jack shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm. Higher ground, now. They scrambled toward the canyon wall as the flood hit a raging torrent that engulfed the beach where they'd been standing moments before. The Black Eagles were caught completely unprepared, swept away with screams that were quickly silenced by the churning water. Blackwood had been higher up, but not high enough. Jack saw him clinging desperately to a rock outcropping as the water rose around him. Their eyes met, across the chaos, mutual recognition of fate's cruel hand. Then the rock gave way and Blackwood disappeared beneath the thundering flood. Jack pulled Sarah higher, finding a narrow ledge 20 feet up the canyon wall. Swift Elk had Thomas and Morrison close behind, all 5 of them pressing against the rock as the water rose inexorably below. Will it reach us? Morrison shouted over the roar. Swift Elk studied the flood, his expression grave. The water will crest soon, but we are trapped until it recedes. Jack realized the scout was right. They had escaped immediate death, but were now stranded on a narrow ledge halfway up a canyon wall, miles from help in winter conditions. Thomas was weakening visibly, shivering uncontrollably from his immersion in the icy river. Jack's own wounded shoulder had gone ominously numb, shock setting in despite his efforts to ignore it. "How long?" he asked Swift Elk. "Hours, perhaps a day." Sarah moved closer to Thomas, trying to share what little body heat she had. "He won't last that long," she said softly. "Not in these wet clothes in this cold." Jack knew she was right. Hypothermia would claim Thomas long before the waters receded enough for them to continue their journey. Perhaps all of them. "There must be another way," Morrison insisted, looking desperately up and down the canyon. Swift Elk shook his head. "The old trails are underwater now. We can only wait." Jack refused to accept this death sentence. They had come too far, endured too much to die now on this forgotten ledge. There had to be something they were missing, some option they hadn't considered. He scanned the canyon walls, looking for any possible route of escape. The cliff above them was too sheer to climb without equipment, especially in their weakened state. Below, the floodwaters continued to rise, already halfway to their ledge. Across the canyon, the opposite wall was equally imposing, with no visible path. Then he saw it, a fallen pine spanning the canyon about 50 yards upstream, wedged between rocks on either side. It had been carried down by the flood, but caught where the canyon narrowed slightly, creating a precarious natural bridge high above the raging water. "There," he pointed. "That tree might support our weight one at a time." The others followed his gaze, hope and doubt warring in their expressions. "It's at least 100 feet across," Morrison objected. "And we'd have to make our way along this ledge to reach it." "The ledge widens upstream," Swift Elk noted, already assessing the possibility. "It could be done." "It's suicide," Morrison insisted. "One slip and you're gone." "Staying here is certain death," Jack countered. "At least this gives us a fighting chance." Thomas straightened, summoning reserves of strength from somewhere deep within. "He's right. We move now while we still can." The decision made, they began the treacherous journey along the narrow ledge, inching sideways with their backs pressed against the canyon wall. Swift Elk led, finding handholds and testing each step before the others followed. Jack came last, ensuring no one fell behind. The ledge indeed widened as they approached the fallen tree, eventually becoming broad enough to allow more confident movement. When they reached the point nearest the natural bridge, Swift Elk studied it critically. "It will hold," he decided, "but the crossing will be difficult. No handholds, and the bark will be slippery from the spray." "I'll go first," Jack volunteered, knowing his experience in precarious situations might make the difference. Sarah caught his arm. "Your shoulder is numb enough not to trouble me." He completed her thought with grim humor. "Besides, I'm the lightest touch on my feet." This wasn't entirely true. Swift Elk moved with the natural grace of a lifetime in the wilderness, but Jack needed to test the crossing himself before risking the others, especially Thomas and Sarah. "If I make it, I'll secure a rope on the other side." He continued, using a branch to fashion a crude walking stick for balance. "If not, find another way." Sarah held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded, understanding the unspoken message. If he fell, they would need to find another solution quickly, or resign themselves to death on this ledge. Jack approached the fallen pine, testing its stability with his makeshift staff. The massive trunk shifted slightly, but held firm, wedged tightly between rocks on either side. Water roared 30 feet below, ready to claim anyone who faltered. Taking a deep breath, Jack stepped onto the tree, finding his balance before attempting to advance. The trunk was nearly 4 feet in diameter at this end, offering a reasonable walking surface, but it would narrow significantly toward the center. Step by careful step, he began the crossing. The bark was indeed slippery, forcing him to dig his boots in for traction. The walking stick proved invaluable, helping him maintain balance when gusts of wind threatened to topple him into the churning water below. He was halfway across when disaster nearly struck. A section of bark tore loose beneath his foot, sending him lurching sideways. Only a desperate jab of his walking stick prevented a fatal fall. Jack froze, heart pounding, acutely aware of the drop on either side. "Steady," he murmured to himself, regaining his composure. "One step at a time." The remainder of the crossing seemed to take hours, though in reality it was perhaps 5 minutes. When Jack finally reached the far side, stepping onto solid rock, his legs nearly buckled with relief. He turned back to signal the others, raising his arm in triumph. On the far ledge, Sarah's smile was visible even at this distance. Swift Elk was already preparing for his crossing, fashioning his own walking stick. The Ute scout made the journey with remarkable agility, despite his age barely hesitating even at the narrowest section. Upon reaching Jack, he immediately began assessing the canyon wall behind them, looking for the best route upward. "Governor Morrison should go next," Jack called across the gap. Then Thomas, with Sarah following to support him if needed. Morrison's crossing was tense but successful, the politician revealing an unexpected steadiness under pressure. Thomas presented the greatest challenge. Weak from captivity and torture, he could barely stand unaided. But the young sheriff's determination was remarkable. With Sarah's help, he began the precarious journey across the fallen tree. Jack watched with his heart in his throat as Thomas inched forward, swaying dangerously at times, but somehow maintaining his balance. When he finally reached the halfway point, Jack allowed himself to hope they might all survive this ordeal after all. Then a new sound cut through the roar of the floodwaters, the sharp crack of a rifle shot, followed by the splintering of wood near Thomas's feet. "Sniper!" Jack shouted, scanning the canyon rim. "Take cover!" But there was no cover on the exposed tree trunk. Thomas froze, unable to advance or retreat without presenting a perfect target. On the far ledge, Sarah pressed herself against the cliff face as another shot ricocheted off the rock near her head. Jack traced the shots to their source, a figure on the canyon rim almost directly above them, the glint of a rifle barrel just visible against the lightening sky. Thornton, Swift Elk, confirmed his keen eyes, picking out details Jack could barely discern. He must have followed the rim trail while his men searched below. Another shot, another near miss, that sent Thomas staggering. The sheriff clung to the tree trunk, completely exposed and impossibly vulnerable. Jack's mind raced, seeking options where none existed. They had no weapons that could reach the canyon rim. No way to distract Thornton long enough for Thomas to complete his crossing. No. His thoughts were interrupted by movement on the far ledge. Sarah had stepped out from her shelter against the cliff, deliberately exposing herself. "Thornton," she shouted, her voice carrying clearly despite the flood's roar. "Maxwell Thornton, face me, you coward!" "Sarah, no," Jack called, but she ignored him, continuing to draw Thornton's attention. "You murdered my husband," she challenged. "You orcharded my son. Now finish what you started, face me directly, instead of hiding behind your hired guns." The strategy was obvious and terrifying. Sarah was offering herself as a target, drawing Thornton's fire to allow Thomas time to cross. A mother's ultimate sacrifice for her child. Jack wanted to scream at her, to take cover, to find another way, but he knew there was no other option. Thomas was completely exposed on that tree trunk, weakening by the moment. Without Sarah's distraction, Thornton would pick him off with his next shot. The rifle on the rim swung toward Sarah, who stood defiant and unflinching. Jack's world narrowed to that terrible moment. Sarah standing tall, Thornton taking aim, Thomas beginning to move forward again on his precarious bridge. The shot, when it came, echoed like thunder through the canyon. But it wasn't Sarah who fell. On the canyon rim, Thornton's figure jerked backward, his rifle tumbling from his hands into the gorge below. A second figure appeared behind him, someone who had approached unseen while Thornton focused on his targets below. "Who?" Morrison began, squinting upward. Lieutenant Cross Swift Elk identified the distant figure. "He lives." Jack could hardly believe it, but the scout's eyes were sharper than his. Somehow, against all odds, Thomas's man had survived and followed Thornton to this final confrontation. On the fallen tree, Thomas seized the opportunity to continue his crossing, moving as quickly as his weakened condition allowed. Sarah remained where she was, watching tensely until her son reached the relative safety of the far side where Jack and Swift Elk helped him onto solid ground. "Your mother!" Thomas gasped, collapsing against Jack. "Get her across!" Jack looked back to the far ledge where Sarah stood waiting. Their eyes met across the gap, and he gestured urgently for her to cross while they had the chance. She began her journey, cautiously displaying the same steady determination she'd shown throughout their ordeal. Jack watched her progress with growing hope they were going to make it, all of them, against impossible odds. Sarah was 3/4 of the way across when a movement on the canyon rim caught Jack's attention. Thornton had regained his feet and was grappling with Lieutenant Cross. The two men locked in a desperate struggle at the very edge of the precipice. As Jack watched in horror, both men lost their balance and plummeted from the rim, falling in a deadly embrace toward the raging flood below. But Thornton wasn't finished. As he fell, he drew a pistol and fired a single shot, not at Cross, but at the base of the fallen tree, where it was wedged against the canyon wall. The impact struck a critical point. With a sound like a cannon shot, the tree trunk cracked and began to shift its supporting rocks dislodged by the bullet's impact. "Sarah!" Jack lunged forward as the natural bridge began to collapse, reaching desperately for her outstretched hand. Their fingers touched, clasped, held, and then Sarah was falling as the tree gave way beneath her. Jack's grip, the only thing preventing her from plunging into the churning waters below. Pain exploded through his wounded shoulder as her full weight jerked against his arm. Black spots danced in his vision, unconsciousness threatening to claim him. But Jack held on, summoning reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed. "I've got you," he gritted through clenched teeth. "Hold on." Swift Elk appeared beside him, grabbing Sarah's other arm. Together, they began to pull her up to safety, inch by agonizing inch. Thomas and Morrison joined them, adding their strength to the rescue. With a final desperate effort, they hauled Sarah over the edge and onto solid ground, all of them collapsing in an exhausted heap as the fallen tree completed its plunge into the flood below. For long moments, they simply lay there, gasping for breath, letting the reality of their survival sink in. Jack found himself still clutching Sarah's hand, unwilling or unable to let go. She returned the pressure, her eyes meeting his, with a depth of emotion that needed no words. "Thornton," Thomas finally asked, looking toward the spot where the railway baron had fallen. Swift Elk moved to the edge, studying the churning waters below. "Gone. Him and the brave lieutenant both. The river has claimed them." "A fitting end," Morrison observed grimly, buried by the very forces he sought to control. Jack helped Sarah sit up, checking her for injuries. Aside from scraped hands and bruises, she seemed remarkably intact physically, at least. The emotional toll of the past days would take longer to assess. "What now?" she asked softly, looking from Jack to her son. Swift Elk pointed up the canyon wall, where a narrow but navigable path was visible leading to the rim above. "We climb." The plateau will lead us to the railway, perhaps 2 miles east. Thomas struggled to his feet, determination overriding his exhaustion. Then we keep moving. This isn't over until the world knows what happened here. Jack nodded, knowing the young sheriff was right. Thornton might be dead, but his corrupt empire remained. The evidence they carried was still vital to ensure justice for those who had suffered under his reign. As they began their ascent toward the canyon rim, Jack found himself walking beside Sarah, their pace matched as if by unspoken agreement. The future remained uncertain, fraught with challenges yet to be faced. But for the first time in years, Jack found himself contemplating possibilities beyond mere survival. "You asked earlier, what comes next?" he said quietly, for her ears alone. "After this is over." Sarah glanced at him, her expression guarded yet hopeful. "And now you have an answer." Jack looked ahead, where Thomas and the others were already making progress up the trail, then back to this remarkable woman who had reminded him what it meant to fight for something beyond himself. "Not yet," he admitted. "But for the first time in a long while, I'm curious to find out." Sarah's smile, small but genuine, was like sunrise after the longest night. "So am I, Jack Rivers." "So am I." Together they continued the climb, leaving Shadow Canyon and its ghosts behind, moving toward whatever dawn might bring. The climb to the canyon rim was an ordeal of endurance. The narrow trail zigzagged up the cliff face, occasionally disappearing altogether, where rock slides or erosion had altered the landscape. In such places, Swift Elk's wilderness experience proved invaluable. The Ute Scout finding subtle handholds and natural steps, invisible to less experienced eyes. Thomas struggled the most, his captivity having depleted his reserves of strength. But the young sheriff possessed a core of iron determination, refusing assistance except when absolutely necessary. Jack recognized the pride that drove him, the same stubborn self-reliance that had allowed Sarah to survive alone in these mountains for years. Morrison fared better than Jack had expected, the territorial governor revealing unexpected stamina beneath his politician's exterior. He maintained a grim silence throughout the climb, his thoughts clearly occupied with the political storm that would erupt once Thornton's crimes became public. By midday, they reached the plateau above the canyon, emerging onto a wind-swept expanse of snow-covered pine forest. The winter sun offered little warmth, but its brightness after the canyon's shadows was momentarily blinding. Jack squinted against the glare, scanning their surroundings for any sign of pursuit. "No tracks," Swift Elk announced after a brief reconnaissance. "The snow fell heavy last night. Any trail is covered." "Good," Jack said, though he remained wary. Thornton might be dead, but his organization wouldn't collapse immediately. The Black Eagles who had survived would be hunting them, seeking revenge, or simply trying to eliminate witnesses. "Which way?" Sarah asked, supporting Thomas, who had sunk to a fallen log, visibly exhausted. Swift Elk oriented himself, studying landmarks visible above the tree line. "East, 2 miles to where the railway cuts through a pass in the ridge. From there we followed the tracks west to Junction City." "How far?" Morrison inquired, his breath frosting in the cold air. 25 miles to Junction City," the scout replied. "If we reach the railway by nightfall, we might catch a maintenance train heading west." Jack did some quick calculations. 25 miles would normally be a long day's march in good conditions. In their current state, injured, exhausted, inadequately clothed for the mountain winter, it was nearly impossible. Thomas certainly couldn't manage it. "Let's focus on reaching the railway," he decided. "We'll reassess our options there." They set off through the forest, Swift Elk breaking trail through snow that sometimes reached their knees in the deeper drifts. Jack took up the rear, partly to guard against pursuit, partly because his wounded shoulder was making it increasingly difficult to maintain pace. The bullet had passed clean through, which meant no surgeon would need to dig out a lead ball, a small mercy. But without proper treatment, infection was a near certainty. Jack had seen enough combat wounds to recognize the warning signs: the unnatural heat radiating from the injury site, the increasing stiffness in his arm, the occasional wave of dizziness that suggested fever was setting in. He kept these observations to himself. There was nothing to be done about it now, and voicing concerns would only add to the group's burden. But Sarah's sharp eyes missed little. When they paused at a stream to drink and refill their canteens, she approached him privately. "Your shoulder's worse," she said, not a question, but a statement of fact. Jack didn't bother denying it. "I've had worse. That's not saying much considering what I've pieced together about your history." She studied him critically. "You need a doctor, proper treatment." "What I need is to get you Thomas and the evidence safely to civilization," Jack countered. "Everything else is secondary." Sarah's expression softened slightly, though concern still creased her brow. "You're a stubborn man, Jack Rivers." "Look who's talking," he replied, with the ghost of a smile. She reached up her gloved hand, gentle against his stubbled cheek. The unexpected tenderness of the gesture caught Jack off guard, cracking the practiced stoicism he'd maintained through countless hardships. "We're going to make it," Sarah said firmly. "All of us." Before Jack could respond, Swift Elk appeared silently beside them, his expression grave. "Riders," he said, simply pointing southwest. Jack followed his gesture, spotting what the scout's sharper eyes had already detected: dark figures moving through the forest perhaps a mile distant. Even at this range, the black coats of the riders were distinctive against the snow. "Black Eagles," he confirmed. "How many?" "8, maybe 10. Following our trail from where we left the canyon." Morrison and Thomas had joined them, tension evident in their postures. "How did they find us so quickly?" the governor demanded. "Thornton would have had men positioned throughout the area," Jack reasoned. "When he and Blackwood failed to return, they would have begun searching systematically." "Can we outrun them?" Sarah asked, looking at Thomas's exhausted form. Swift Elk shook his head. "They have horses. We are on foot." "Then we need to reach the railway before they catch up," Jack decided. "Swift Elk, how far?" 1 mile, maybe less." Jack nodded, his tactical mind already mapping options. "We make for the railway at best speed. If we can't outrun them, we'll need to find a defensible position." They set off at a pace that bordered on reckless jogging through the snow, where the ground allowed negotiating obstacles as quickly as safety permitted. Thomas pushed himself beyond what should have been his limits, driven by the knowledge that failure meant death, or worse. Sarah stayed close to her son, ready to support him if he faltered. Jack felt his own strength waning as they progressed, the combination of blood loss, infection, and exertion taking a mounting toll. He forced himself to continue through sheer will, fixing his focus on the backs of his companions, putting one foot in front of the other with mechanical determination. The forest began to thin as they approached the railway, cut the land rising toward a rocky ridge that formed a natural dividing line between watersheds. Swift Elk led them up a game trail that wound between granite outcroppings, eventually emerging onto a promontory overlooking the railway line below. "We made it," Morrison said with palpable relief. Jack wasn't so optimistic. From their elevated position, he could see the railway cutting through the pass, about 200 yards away, twin lines of steel stretching east toward Denver and west toward Junction City. But he could also see their pursuers much closer now, perhaps half a mile back, but gaining steadily. "They'll be on us before we can follow the tracks far enough to escape," he assessed grimly. "Then we make our stand here," Thomas said, drawing himself up despite his exhaustion. This position has good visibility, some natural cover. Jack studied the terrain with a soldier's eye. The promontory did offer certain advantages, elevation, clear fields of fire rocks for cover. But they were still outnumbered and outgunned. One problem, he pointed out, we have exactly 2 revolvers between us and limited ammunition. They had salvaged what they could after their river journey, but water had ruined most of their paper cartridges. Jack estimated they had perhaps 10 viable rounds between his Colt and Thomas's recovered service revolver. We need to split up, Morrison suggested. Some of us create a diversion, while others escape with the evidence. Jack shook his head. They'd run down anyone on foot within minutes. A distant whistle cut through their deliberation, the unmistakable sound of a locomotive approaching from the east. They turned toward the sound, spotting a plume of smoke rising above the trees several miles down the track. "A train," Sarah said, hope kindling in her voice. "If we can reach it." "It will be moving too fast to board," Jack cautioned. "These grades are steep. Engineers, keep up speed to maintain momentum." Swift Elk had been scanning the railway with narrowed eyes. "There!" He pointed to a small structure beside the tracks about a quarter-mile east of their position. "Railway telegraph station. For emergencies." Jack's tactical assessment shifted immediately. "If we can reach it, we can wire for help, maybe even signal the train to stop." "And it's defensible," Thomas added, his lawman's instincts engaged, despite his weakened state. "Those maintenance buildings are built solid to withstand mountain winters." The decision was made in an instant. They descended from the promontory as quickly as caution allowed, making for the railway line below. Once they reached the tracks, they turned east toward the small building Swift Elk had spotted. It was a standard railway telegraph station, a sturdy structure about 20 feet square, with a steeply pitched roof to shed snow. A semaphore signal stood beside it, used to flag down trains when necessary. The door was locked, but Thomas made short work of it with techniques learned during his years in law enforcement. The interior was Spartan, but offered blessed shelter from the wind and cold. A pot-bellied stove occupied one corner, telegraph equipment another. Simple bunks lined one wall. Accommodations for maintenance workers stranded during storms. A rifle rack stood empty beside the door, disappointing but not surprising. Morrison went immediately to the telegraph key, his fingers moving with unexpected familiarity across the brass contacts. "You can operate that?" Sarah asked, surprise evident in her voice. The governor nodded, already tapping out a message. "I worked as a telegraph operator to put myself through law school. A skill I never expected to need again." Jack moved to the window, keeping watch on their back trail, while Morrison sent his message. The Black Eagles were visible now, dark figures on horseback following their tracks in the snow with methodical precision. "How long?" he asked Morrison. "Message sent," the governor replied. "Junction City confirms receipt. They're dispatching marshals on the eastbound train we heard, but it will be at least an hour before they reach us." "We don't have an hour," Jack said grimly. "Our friends will be here in 10 minutes, maybe less." Thomas joined him at the window, revolver in hand. "Then we hold them off. This building gives us cover limits, their ability to surround us." "With 10 rounds of ammunition," Jack reminded him, "against 8 armed men." Sarah had been examining the station's supplies. "We have more than bullets," she announced, indicating a shelf of tools and maintenance supplies. "Blasting powder, fuses, oil tools. Railway workers need to handle all kinds of repairs." Jack's estimation of their chances improved slightly. With improvised weapons and their defensible position, they might hold out until reinforcements arrived. It wasn't much, but it was better than facing death in the open. They worked quickly, preparing for the coming assault. Jack and Thomas positioned themselves at windows on opposite sides of the building, covering the most likely approaches. Sarah and Swift Elk assembled makeshift weapons glass oil lamps that could be lit and thrown tools that could serve as clubs in close quarters. Morrison maintained his position at the telegraph, sending updates and receiving confirmations. "They've stopped," Swift Elk announced. Suddenly, his keen eyes tracking their pursuers. "Half-mile back, dismounting." Jack studied the distant figures. "They're not charging in blindly. Smart. They'll scout our position first, look for weaknesses." "Let them look," Thomas said with grim satisfaction. "Every minute they delay brings the train closer." Jack wasn't so optimistic. The Black Eagles had been trained by Thornton, a military man who understood tactics. They wouldn't simply rush a defended position. They'd probe, test, then strike where vulnerability was found. His assessment proved accurate. Two riders separated from the main group, circling wide to approach the station from different angles. The others established positions behind rocks and trees, rifles ready. "They're setting up a crossfire," Jack observed. "When those scouts report back, they'll try to pin us down from multiple directions, while others approach under cover." "Standard cavalry tactics," Morrison agreed, joining them at the window. "Cut off escape routes, then apply overwhelming force." Outside, the mountain afternoon was waning, shadows lengthening as the sun dipped toward the western peaks. The temperature was already dropping noticeably, a reminder that night in these elevations brought deadly cold. Jack checked his revolver one final time, ensuring the cylinder moved freely, and the firing mechanism was clean after their river journey. 6 rounds, 5 in the cylinder, 1 in his pocket as a reserve. Thomas had 4. Each shot would need to count. "Listen," he said to the others, his voice low but carrying. "When they attack, stay away from the windows, except to fire. Use cover, keep moving within the building. If they breach the door, fall back to the far corner where we've stacked the bunks." Sarah met his eyes, reading the unspoken message. Their chances were slim at best. "We'll make it count," she promised. The scouts had completed their circuit of the station, rejoining the main group. Jack could see them conferring, gesturing toward different approaches, making their plan. "Get ready," he warned. "They'll come soon before we lose the light." As if on cue, rifle fire erupted from multiple positions, bullets splintering the wooden walls and shattering windows. Jack and Thomas ducked below the windowsills, glass raining down around them. "They're trying to keep our heads down while others advance," Jack shouted over the gunfire. "Watch for movement!" Between volleys, he risked quick glances outside. Sure enough, 3 Black Eagles were using the covering fire to approach from the blind side of the building, carrying what looked like a fallen tree trunk, a makeshift battering ram for the door. Jack took careful aim and fired. One of the men staggered, clutching his leg, but the others continued their advance. Thomas fired from his position, missing his target, but forcing the attackers to momentarily seek cover. "They're going for the door," Jack called. Sarah was ready. She had prepared several oil-soaked rags wrapped around rocks taken from the stove. Swift Elk lit one as Jack provided covering fire from the window. When the Black Eagles charged the final distance to the door, Sarah hurled her improvised firebomb through the broken window. It landed perfectly, exploding in flames directly in the path of the advancing men. They faltered momentarily, blinded by the sudden blaze. Jack and Thomas each took the opportunity to fire again, dropping one attacker and sending the others scrambling back to cover. "Good work," Jack acknowledged. "But they'll try again." The rifle fire intensified, peppering the station from all sides now. The wooden walls, while sturdy, weren't designed to withstand sustained gunfire. Bullets penetrated in places, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. Morrison ducked as a round passed inches from his head. "Junction City reports the train is 20 minutes out," he shouted. "They've armed the crew, have marshals aboard." "We need to hold that long," Jack replied, checking his ammunition. 4 rounds remaining. The Black Eagles were regrouping, changing tactics. 2 men circled to the roof, climbing via a drainage pipe at the rear corner. Jack spotted the movement and fired, but missed in the growing darkness. "The roof," he warned. "They'll try to smoke us out." Even as he spoke, they heard movement overhead, boots on wooden shingles. Then a new sound, liquid splashing across the roof. The sharp odor of coal oil reached them moments later. "They're going to burn us out," Thomas realized. Jack calculated rapidly. If the roof caught fire, they'd have minutes at most before the entire structure became an inferno. They could try to escape, but would be cut down in the open by the waiting riflemen. A match flared on the roof, visible through a gap in the boards. Jack aimed carefully and fired. The light vanished with a cry of pain, but it was only a momentary reprieve. Another match would follow. "The semaphore," Swift Elk said suddenly. "The train will stop if the signal shows danger." He was right. Railway protocol required engineers to stop if the line semaphore was set to its danger position, a horizontal arm indicating obstruction ahead. "Cover me," the Ute scout said, moving toward the door. "It's suicide," Jack objected. "They have clear shots at the signal." "I am Ute," Swift Elk replied simply. "I can move unseen when necessary." Before anyone could further object, he slipped through a small ventilation hatch at the rear of the station, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Jack wanted to call him back, but knew the scout was right. The semaphore represented their best chance. On the roof, they could hear movement again, someone preparing for another attempt to ignite the coal oil. Jack's revolver had 1 round remaining. Thomas's was empty. Their situation was rapidly becoming desperate. "Jack," Sarah said softly, moving to his side. "If this is the end—" "It's not," he interrupted, though his own conviction was wavering. "Not yet." Another match flared on the roof. Jack aimed his final shot and fired, but missed. Flames erupted above them as the coal oil ignited, spreading rapidly across the wooden shingles. "Get down," Jack ordered, herding everyone toward the center of the room, away from the walls where the fire would spread first. "Stay low where the air is clearest." Smoke began seeping through the ceiling boards, filling the upper portion of the station. The heat intensified rapidly, the aged wooden roof dried by decades of mountain sun, burning like tinder. Outside rifle fire continued sporadically, keeping them pinned inside the burning building. Jack searched desperately for options, finding none. They were trapped with minutes at most before the fire reached them or smoke overcame them. "The train," Thomas coughed, pointing through a window toward the eastern curve of the track. "Look." In the distance, a bright light appeared around the bend, the headlamp of an approaching locomotive. But it was still miles away, too distant to arrive before the fire consumed them. "The semaphore!" Sarah gasped through the thickening smoke. "Swift Elk hasn't reached it." But Jack made his decision in an instant. "Stay here. Keep low. Breathe through wet cloth if you have it." He moved toward the door, staying below the gunfire still peppering the walls. "Jack, no." Sarah caught his arm. "They'll kill you the moment you step outside." He met her eyes through the swirling smoke. "If that train doesn't stop, we all die anyway." Before she could object further, Jack lunged for the door, throwing it open and rolling outside in a single desperate movement. Gunfire erupted immediately, bullets kicking up dirt around him. He scrambled on hands and knees toward the semaphore post 20 yards away, expecting at any moment to feel the impact of a rifle round. But the shots were less accurate than they should have been. The growing darkness, the distraction of the burning building, the smoke drifting across the railway, cut all worked in Jack's favor. He reached the base of the semaphore post, his lungs burning from exertion and smoke inhalation. The control lever was simple, a metal rod that rotated the signal arm above. Jack grasped it with both hands, ignoring the pain that shot through his wounded shoulder. The mechanism was stiff, resisting his efforts. He strained against it, muscles trembling with the effort. Finally, with a groan of protesting metal, the lever moved. Above the semaphore arm rotated to its horizontal position, the universal signal for danger ahead. Stop immediately. Jack looked eastward, seeking the train's headlamp. It was closer now, perhaps a mile distant, its bright beam cutting through the mountain dusk. But would the engineer see the signal in time? The curves of mountain track gave limited visibility, and trains needed distance to stop on these steep grades. A rifle shot cracked past his ear, too close for comfort. Jack threw himself flat beside the semaphore post, the minimal cover it offered his only protection. The Black Eagles had spotted him, were concentrating their fire on his position. More bullets struck around him, kicking up splinters from the wooden post and dirt from the railway embankment. Jack pressed himself into the ground, making as small a target as possible, but knew it was only a matter of time before a shot found him. Then a new sound reached him, the scream of steel brakes being applied to steel wheels, the distinctive hiss of a locomotive's emergency stop procedure. The engineer had seen the danger signal. The train was attempting to stop, but it was still too far away. The Black Eagles were closing in, abandoning their cover now to rush Jack's exposed position. He could see them advancing through the smoke and growing darkness, black shapes against the burning station behind them. Jack prepared himself for the end, determined to go down fighting. He scrambled to his knees, retrieving a rock from the railway embankment, a pathetic weapon against rifles, but all he had left. The lead Black Eagle raised his weapon, taking aim at Jack's chest from 30 paces too close to miss. Jack tensed, preparing to throw his rock in a final futile gesture of defiance. The shot that rang out didn't come from the Black Eagle's rifle. It came from somewhere to Jack's right, from the direction of the burning station. The Black Eagle crumpled his unfired weapon, falling from lifeless hands. More shots followed in rapid succession, precise, deadly. The advancing Black Eagles faltered, turning toward this new threat. 2 more fell before they could properly react. Through the smoke and gathering darkness, Jack saw a figure advancing steadily from the station. Sarah McKenna, her silver hair gleaming in the firelight, a rifle in her hands that she worked with practiced efficiency. Behind her came Thomas, similarly armed, providing covering fire despite his weakened condition. The remaining Black Eagles broke, retreating toward the cover of the forest. Sarah reached Jack's position, kneeling beside him. "Are you hit?" she demanded, her eyes scanning him for new injuries. "No." He managed, still trying to process what he'd just witnessed. "Where did you get the rifles?" A thin smile touched her lips. Swift Elk. He didn't go for the semaphore, he circled around to where they'd left their horses, brought back their spare weapons. As if summoned by his name, the Ute scout materialized from the darkness, 2 more rifles slung across his back. "The train comes," he said, simply pointing eastward. The locomotive was indeed approaching its massive form, now clearly visible as it slowed on the steep grade. Steam billowed from its emergency brake application, the wheels throwing sparks as they fought for purchase on the rails. The Black Eagles had regrouped at the forest's edge, uncertain whether to continue their attack or retreat. The burning station cast an apocalyptic glow over the scene, flames now consuming the entire roof and beginning to spread down the walls. "Morrison?" Jack asked suddenly, remembering the governor. "Safe," Sarah assured him. "Still inside, but they're making for the door now." The train's whistle sounded 3 short blasts that echoed off the canyon walls. a signal that it had spotted them and was attempting to stop. "It's going to be close," Jack observed, noting the train's speed and remaining distance. The locomotive thundered toward them, still moving faster than a man could run, despite the engineer's efforts to slow it. Jack could see figures leaning from the cab and the first carriage railway marshals or crew trying to assess the situation ahead. "We need to move away from the tracks," he urged, pulling himself to his feet with effort. Sarah helped support him, her arm strong around his waist. Thomas and Swift Elk covered their retreat from the semaphore post, keeping the remaining Black Eagles at bay with occasional shots from their captured rifles. They had just reached a safe distance when the train finally ground to a halt beside the burning station, the locomotive's massive form blocking most of the building from view. Armed men immediately poured from the carriages, railway marshals in their distinctive uniforms, weapons at the ready. "Governor Morrison!" Jack shouted to them, pointing toward the station's door, where Morrison had indeed appeared, coughing but alive. "Protect the governor!" The marshals responded instantly, several rushing to Morrison's side, while others established a defensive perimeter. Their commander, a grizzled veteran with a cavalry mustache and marshal's star, approached Jack's group. "Marshal James Harker," he introduced himself curtly. "Junction City Office. Governor Morrison's telegram said you had Black Eagles on your tail." Yeah, Jack gestured toward the forest edge where shadows still moved among the trees. "What's left of them? Maybe 4 or 5 still active." Harker nodded immediately, dispatching men to secure the perimeter. "We'll round them up or run them off." He turned back to Jack, his experienced eyes taking in their battered condition. "You folks look like you've been through hell." "Something like that," Sarah replied wearily. Thomas straightened, despite his exhaustion, his lawman's instincts asserting themselves. "Marshal, we have evidence of multiple murders, kidnapping, illegal imprisonment, and land fraud. Governor Morrison carries documentation that will implicate dozens of officials from here to Denver." Harker's eyes narrowed. "Thornton's operation?" "Yes," Jack confirmed, "though Thornton himself is dead, washed away in the Eagle River when his dam collapsed." "Good riddance," Harker muttered. "Been trying to build a case against him for years, but he was too well connected." He gestured toward the train. "We need to get you folks to safety. Get statements while everything's fresh. Junction City has a doctor can see to your injuries." Jack nodded gratefully, the adrenaline of combat fading, leaving him acutely aware of his wounded shoulder and general exhaustion. The prospect of medical attention and safety was almost overwhelming after days of continuous danger. As railway workers fought to contain the station fire and marshals secured the area, Jack found himself seated on a bench in the relative comfort of the train's passenger car. Sarah sat beside him, her shoulder touching his in a contact that seemed both casual and deliberate. "You almost died out there," she said quietly. "At the semaphore." Jack shrugged, then winced as the movement aggravated his wound. "Seemed like the right thing to do at the time." "It was brave. Foolish, but brave," says the woman who charged armed men with a stolen rifle. He countered with a hint of a smile. Sarah's expression softened. "I couldn't let you die out there alone." The simple statement contained depths that Jack wasn't sure he was ready to explore. He'd been alone for so long by necessity, by choice, by the inexorable logic of a life lived outside the law. The possibility of something else of connection and purpose beyond survival was both tantalizing and terrifying. Governor Morrison joined them, his expensive coat stained with soot, but his bearing as dignified as circumstances allowed. "Marshal Harker tells me we'll be underway to Junction City within the hour, once they've secured the area and salvaged what they can from the station." "The evidence," Thomas asked, ever the lawman. Morrison patted his inner coat pocket. Safe. I've already briefed Harker on its significance. He's assigned 2 deputies to guard it, and me until we reach Denver. Jack nodded approval. The political fallout from Thornton's crimes would be substantial, affecting powerful interests throughout the territory. There would be those who preferred the evidence never reach the public. What happens now? Sarah asked. To Thomas, to all of us. Justice, Morrison replied firmly. I'll need your testimonies, all of you, to corroborate the documentary evidence. But I give you my word, as Governor Thornton's accomplices will face the consequences of their actions. And the mine, Thomas pressed. The lost condor. Morrison glanced at Sarah. The claim appears legally valid, held by your family. What happens to it should be your decision, Mrs. McKenna. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering. My husband believed the mine should remain undisturbed, that some treasures exact too high a price. She looked at Swift Elk. The Ute considered its sacred land to be protected rather than exploited. The scout nodded solemnly. Your husband understood what many white men do not, that wealth from the earth taken without respect brings only suffering. Then that's my decision as well, Sarah declared. The mine stays closed. The claim remains active only to ensure no one else can exploit it. Morrison looked surprised, but didn't argue. As you wish. It's your right. He turned to Jack, his expression becoming more formal. Mr. Rivers, there's also the matter of the charges against you in Denver. Jack tensed instinctively, calculating escape routes, despite his exhaustion. After everything, he might still end up in chains. Those charges were fabricated at Thornton's direction. Thomas interjected, his voice carrying the authority of his office, despite his weakened condition. As county sheriff, I can attest that Jack Rivers has been instrumental in exposing a criminal conspiracy and saving multiple lives, including mine and the governor's. Morrison nodded. Precisely my thinking. I've already drafted a full pardon, which I'll sign and telegraph to Denver as soon as we reach Junction City. He extended his hand to Jack. The territory of Colorado owes you a debt, sir. Jack stared at the offered hand for a moment, struggling to process the implications. A pardon, freedom from the pursuit that had defined his existence for years, the possibility of a life no longer spent, looking over his shoulder. He shook Morrison's hand, finding no words adequate to the moment. Well, the governor said briskly, I should check on our departure status. Excuse me. As Morrison moved away, Jack sat in stunned silence. The future, suddenly, a blank page rather than a predetermined script of continued flight and inevitable, violent end. A pardon, Sarah said softly beside him. What will you do with such freedom, Jack Rivers? It was the question he'd been avoiding, the one that loomed now like a mountain peak, on the horizon, impossible to ignore, challenging to surmount. I don't know, he admitted. I've been running so long I'm not sure I remember how to stand still. Sarah's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his own, in a gesture that seemed both protective and possessive. Then, perhaps you need something worth standing still for. Jack met her eyes, seeing in them a reflection of his own uncertain hope. Or someone, perhaps. A smile touched her lips, genuine but cautious. Though I'm set in my ways, Mr. Rivers, and I have a wounded son who'll need care for some time. I've nursed a few wounds in my day, Jack replied, surprising himself with the offering implicit in his words. And I'm told I'm a fair hand at cabin repairs. Thomas had been resting nearby, but Jack's words roused him to alertness. Are you two negotiating some sort of arrangement? He asked, his tone caught between amusement and brotherly protectiveness. Sarah fixed her son with a look that transcended his status as sheriff, reminding him he was still very much her child. Thomas McKenna, I raised you, buried your father, and just rescued you from certain death. I believe I've earned the right to consider my own path forward without committee approval. Thomas raised his hands in mock surrender. Yes, ma'am. Just making sure Mr. Rivers understands what he might be getting himself into. Jack couldn't help the chuckle that escaped him, the first genuine laugh he could remember in longer than he cared to admit. I think that's still very much under discussion, Sheriff. Swift Elk, who had been silently observing the exchange, spoke up with unexpected gentleness. The winter is long in these mountains. A warm hearth and good company make the cold months pass easier. Outside, a whistle sounded the engineer's signal that they were preparing to depart. Railway workers were boarding marshals, taking their positions. The immediate danger had passed, leaving the more complex challenge of rebuilding lives interrupted by violence and loss. Jack felt the train lurch beneath them, wheels engaging as they began their journey west toward Junction City. Sarah's hand remained in his, a point of warmth and connection that defied the cold mountain night gathering outside their windows. He didn't know what awaited him, what awaited any of them in the days and weeks ahead. The path to justice for Thornton's crimes would be neither simple nor swift. Thomas faced a long recovery. The political landscape of the territory would be transformed by the revelations to come. But for the first time in years, Jack Rivers allowed himself to contemplate a future measured not in days or miles of flight, but in seasons, years, shared moments. It was both terrifying and exhilarating, like standing on the edge of an unexplored wilderness. As the train gathered speed, carrying them away from Shadow Canyon and its ghosts, Jack watched the darkening landscape slip past. Snow was beginning to fall again, large flakes catching the light from the train's windows before dissolving into the gathering night. You're thinking too hard, Sarah observed beside him. Jack smiled, not denying it. Old habits. Winter's coming, she said, echoing Swift Elk's earlier observation. The cabin gets cold. I've been told I generate considerable heat, Jack replied, surprising himself with the lightness in his voice. A useful quality in mountain country. Sarah's laughter was soft, but genuine. We'll see, Mr. Rivers. We'll see. The train rounded a bend, the last view of Shadow Canyon disappearing behind them. Ahead lay Junction City, Denver, the complexities of testimony and justice and rebuilding. But in this moment, in the warm car with Sarah's hand in his and the promise of possibility before them, Jack Rivers, gunman, fugitive survivor, allowed himself to believe in something he had long ago abandoned. A future. Not just survival, but life. The last winter warrior watched the snow fall beyond the glass, and for the first time in years, welcomed the coming season not as an adversary to be endured, but as a time of restoration, of healing, of beginning again. End of Part 5. The End.